Okay, what's up, everybody? How's it going? It's Berk, aka Dansg08 here, and today is a special podcast because I am joined by Darryl from FFUnion, a real scholar of Final Fantasy. So, welcome, Darryl.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be here, and it's nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, this is actually the first time we've had like a voice chat like this. We've had each other on Discord for a little while, but we've never actually chatted like this before, so it should be fun.
I'm looking forward to it.
So, how have you been holding up in the UK during these insane times?
It's been a rough. It's almost a year now. It's been really crazy that it's been that long, and there's been ups and downs throughout the year for sure. I don't know how many people know that, but Laura and I, who my wife Lauren, who runs the channel with me, we have two kids that are 5 and 2, and so it's been very interesting juggling, looking after them while running the channel, and I also work full time as well still. So it's definitely been a roller coaster, and yeah, there's been ups and downs. There's been lockdowns, out of lockdowns. There's been school. There's been no school. It's been a challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. How old are the kids?
5 and 2.
Oh, okay, right. So nurseries are still open, right?
They are, but they have their kind of, if there's any cases at the nursery, then the nursery gets shut down for a period of time. So we've had that once or twice, I think, where it's just been, yeah, we've got to isolate the 2-year-old only for
Oh
2 weeks.
man.
So yeah, she can't go outside or do anything for a period of
Oof.
time. And then yeah, so it's and then we had in December our eldest Alessandra, or Ali as we call her. She had her tonsils out as well, so she basically had to have almost a month at home to recover from that. And also it was around Christmas holidays as well, so it's been fun. It's been fun. I'll say that. It's been an experience.
Especially in the UK, I think the UK especially has been one of the worst hit places in this kind of sense because I feel like in terms of measures, we've had so many quote unquote measures, and we've spent so much time in lockdown since March last year, but it's still so bad at the moment. It's just like, when is it going to get better? I'm just, it's gotten to the stage where I'm really starting to feel like drained from this whole situation now. It's getting really, really long now.
Yeah, hopefully we can turn the corner really soon. It looks like the cases are going down. I don't know if that means that the lockdown is going to end anytime soon, but fingers crossed, eh?
I hope so, man. It really has, like you said, it's been fun in a sense, and it's obviously just been really difficult and really insane as well. I mean, in terms of YouTube, has it benefited you? I mean, I get people asking me all the time. They're like, "Oh, during the pandemic, people are at home, they're watching YouTube. Your channel must have been doing so well. That must be a great time for you." And so, what's it been like for you, for example?
I'd say it's been probably not too different from normal, actually. And I say that because although, yes, there were more people watching content, we weren't able to put content out as consistently. And like I think some of the stuff that maybe people aren't too aware of is the pressures around certain things. So actually, one of the worst times for us was the launch of the 7 remake, because
Mm-hmm.
that happened right when the first lockdown came into effect,
Yep.
and we had to juggle basically our eldest wasn't at school then, but her nursery was shut completely, and we had to juggle trying to review the game in a really short period of time, get the review video done, and all while having the kids around at the same time. So I had to try. Like, I was basically getting up at sort of 5 o'clock in the morning, going to bed sort of around 11, 12 at night, every day for pretty much a week, and it just killed me. And then we put the review out, and there were lots of comments about, even though we tried to keep it as spoiler free as possible, it wasn't spoiler free enough apparently. So like we put our heart and souls into this thing for like a week, and then the result at the end of it wasn't great either. So it was like, oh man, this has been such a time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that was a really crunch. I think for me, it was about 10 days or so. I can't imagine going through that crunch with kids as well. I think, as YouTubers, obviously, we try our best to sort of just enjoy ourselves and just make the content we want to make when we want to make it and enjoy the creative freedoms that come with what we do. But sometimes, like, certain things happen where it's like, if Final Fantasy VII Remake is coming out, you have to put the work in. There's no, like, that's such a huge thing for channels like ours. You really have to sacrifice a lot of time and a lot of energy to be able to get the content out there on time. And so I definitely know what you've been through, and especially with kids at that side of it, I can't even imagine how difficult it must have been. But I think another thing that people they didn't really realize was that, I'm sure you probably experienced the same, but ad revenue really went down hard, like when the lockdown began. That happened for you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, April when the 7 remake came out was the best month we'd ever had in the history of the channel,
Yep,
and our revenue was probably about half of what it should have been during that
yep,
time.
yep. That's literally what I told people as well. It's like, yeah, great. Like on paper, I got incredible amount of views when Final Fantasy 7 Remake came out, but if you do this as like a job and you rely on the income from it, it was a tough time for 2 or 3 months at least. It was definitely tough.
And there's been fluctuations throughout the whole year as well. I mean, even in November, we saw a massive, like normally you'd have the sort of rates continuing to rise steadily as the year goes through, but in November we saw a massive decline. So like it's been such a strange time, because like even though that you can kind of gauge what's going to happen throughout the year, it just was all over the place. So yeah, you could have good months, you could have bad months. It was just so inconsistent, and we'd have months where one month to the next our revenue might drop by half. For no, we didn't do anything different. It's just that
Yep.
something else changed that was completely out of our hands. And so the only way you can combat that is to produce more content, to try and get more views, to try and compensate. But obviously that is not feasible most of the time to do that.
Of course,
And
yeah.
so yeah, it was definitely an interesting one, because yeah, like I don't think too many people were appreciating that just because there's more people watching. It's counterbalanced by the fact that you're making less revenue from the people that are watching. So
Hmm.
it, we tried to be pragmatic about it and look at the long term view. So we had a great month in April. We had so many people join the channel as well, and we had to hope that things would return to normal at some point, and we continue to be able to put out quality content that people would enjoy, so that in the long run things would kind of turn around, and when things return back to normal, we'd be in a good place.
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo those thoughts pretty much exactly. That's how I try to see things as well. I mean, in the long term, like you say, a lot of new subscribers coming in, a lot of people, the community expanded, and those are people that hopefully are going to stick around and continue to enjoy the content in better days. So in that sense, like in the long run, I mean, your channel, especially, I think over the last 2 or 3 years, I think you guys have had a really positive expansion, and you guys have become basically, well, at least in my eyes, I think when it comes to just raw Final Fantasy content that isn't just like, my channel's more kind of LP kind of stuff, and I do obviously other games and whatnot. But when it comes to just like a focused Final Fantasy themed channel, I think you guys are probably the biggest and the best that there is on YouTube at this stage.
Well, thank you. I mean, when we started out, we didn't really have an objective in mind, but it's been crazy to see how the channel has grown and how people have resonated with the type of content that we create. And I think we've always been really careful with the types of videos that we do make, not to kind of fall into certain traps, I guess, in terms of like we try not to kind of fall foul of the YouTube algorithm and play that game. But it obviously sometimes it's harder than others, and there are certain expectations that people do have on us. I remember many years ago, before we really had the channel going, when the 7 remake was announced, for example, we obviously were still doing Final Fantasy coverage around that time, but we weren't expecting anything to really be announced at E3. No one was, right? But not least the 7 remake. So we were on holiday, and we woke up in the morning, and we had so many messages from people just complaining about the fact that we hadn't even responded to the fact that the 7 remake had been announced. And it's like, well, why would we have had? We were like asleep. like like it's just weird, like sometimes when we don't talk about things, people start getting a bit weirded out about it. I guess because of the, as you said, like there's that expectation because of who we are. Like when Sephiroth was announced for Smash, we had so many people requesting we make a video about it, and I was just thinking, yeah, I mean, we could do that, but I don't really know what I'd say.
Yeah.
So it didn't really make sense for us to do so, even though we probably could have done. We just prefer to focus on other things that we feel would add more value to people.
I think that's probably the right way to go about it. I mean, with my own channel, obviously, I think as your channel grows, like especially for me, I kind of unintentionally became a sort of someone that people look to for Final Fantasy like information and all that kind of thing as well. But I never really wanted to turn into like a Final Fantasy news channel, as it were, because I feel like whenever you shift your content towards something that relies more on how fresh and how recent it is, then you get caught up in this sort of mental thing about you always have to be making timely content. So, every time, like you say, like for you guys, like Sephiroth and Smash and that kind of thing, for me, I just retweeted something about it. Like I saw the trailer, it looked cool, I just retweeted it, and that was that. But if I was the kind of channel that was kind of, I needed to make news about it, it's always like, oh, well, got to make another video now. Got to make a video on this. Oh, this has happened. Got to make sure I don't miss that. And I felt like that's not how I really want to run my channel. So if there's something major, like obviously the Final Fantasy 16 trailer was huge, and I wanted to sort of, share my thoughts on that with people. But as like a general type of content, I've always just tried to stay away from trying to sort of be a more news type of channel, I think. And for me, like for my own sanity and like for my own enjoyment of what I do, I think that's definitely been better. And I think you guys are probably doing the right thing with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, we started out having more of a focus around news, just because that's where we came from. Really, we obviously ran the website, and our podcast was focused around news and trying to be as current as possible. And when we transitioned to YouTube, that was one of the things that we thought we'd be really good at, just churning things out really quickly. But especially as the kids popped along and became a bigger focus in our lives, it was just not. Yeah, as you said, it wasn't great for our mental sanity, because like that you have to be on the pulse of everything. You have to get content out really, really quickly. And it would be often a case where I'd come home from work in the evening, we'd kind of have our dinner, and then I'd have to kind of crank out a script in about sort of hour and a half, record it, Lauren would edit, and we try and get a video turned around in a couple of hours. And sometimes that was just so hard, and then when there's nothing happening as well, you're kind of scraping the barrel, and it led to a lot of burnout, I'd say, and just fatigue in general with what we were doing, especially because sometimes like you can do videos that do really well. Like we were doing all that news coverage around when 15 had just come out, so there was stuff happening all the time because Tabata and his team were talking about that game almost every day, about something new that was happening, a new patch, new content that was planned down the line. There was always something going on that we could talk about, and people were just eating it up. You could put out like a 2-minute video about an update, and it could get a couple of 100,000 views. But obviously, like once that started to die down, what's the interest? And so we decided that we were, instead of focusing on kind of like short, quick, we'd focus on more long form. So when we do still occasionally talk about news, but when we do, it's a much more methodical approach. So most recently with the 16 update for the website, we didn't talk about it for like 2-3 weeks, but when we did, we tried to join a lot of dots together. We did a lot of investigation in terms of what had actually been revealed, and went a bit deeper than perhaps some other people had done. Maybe that's what we try and do, at least to try and make sure if we are going to do a video about news, there has to be some real substance behind it. Like we're not just going to put out a video because there was a small interview done by someone.
Yeah, and I mean, from what I've seen of your channel, I mean, you don't seem to try and be too sort of headliney in that sense, like trying to be like a tabloid and just try and like soak up views by coming out with like the most eye-catching headlines. Like it might be like a tiny little nugget of information, and you make that seem like it's this giant announcement about something that's going to happen and that kind of thing. So I think in that sense, like I said, I like the way that you guys do things, and at the end of the day, I think it shows in the success the channel's had that you guys are continuing to do a great job.
Well, thank you.
But what I'd like to do at this stage is go back to like right back to the beginning and find out how it all started for you guys, because you're saying like even at this stage, despite how big the channel is now, you still have a full-time job. So like back when you didn't have the channel, how did it all begin?
So, I mean, I've been part of the community of Final Fantasy, involved in various websites for about 20 years now, and I've always kind of been involved in some shape or form in like forums, various different websites. Like I think my first one was a website called Final Fantasy Online, and then I kind of got serious when I started to take music more seriously, after being inspired by the Final Fantasy VIII soundtrack. I don't know what it was, and I know that it's happened to some other people as well. But there was something about the Final Fantasy VIII soundtrack specifically that just really resonated with people who had an interest in music, but it was kind of like a latent interest in music. Like I taught myself how to play the piano, but I wasn't too serious about it. But when I heard the 8 soundtrack, there was just something in it that just made me think, I need to learn how to play this, and I'm not going to stop until I have learned how to play this. So I think the landing I just had on repeat, just on my TV. And I was sat there with my keyboard for hours upon hours, days upon days, just learning how to play that from ear. And then I think I was in like year 9 at school at the time, which for Americans won't mean anything. But for anyone in the UK, year 9, I think I must have been like 14, 15.
Yeah, I think it's like 13, 14.
Yeah, like for some reason, in music, I'd not really done well at all in music classes. But then I did that, and it just kind of clicked something in my head, and suddenly I became one of the better musicians in the class. I could play the keyboard with 2 hands. Never could do that before. I like just taught myself all these skills just so I could like play the piece. And then I took GCSE music randomly, and I joined up to some music forums, and one of them was a Final Fantasy music forum called Final Fantasy Music Online, to get some feedback on, because I'd started composing music as well. So I wanted to get some feedback. And I thought, what better place than a place where it's about Final Fantasy and music? It was great, like a community that I can really resonate with. They'll probably be a lot kinder with their feedback to me. And I just really got on with the people there, and it ended up, I met a really good friend there who I ended up founding another website with called All World Final Fantasy, which was focused around artwork from the franchise. And then I kind of fell out of love with it in and around the release of 12. The game just at the time just really didn't appeal to me, and it just made me become a bit disillusioned with everything. I kind of fell out of the communities, but once I'd finished my degree, I really wanted to teach myself a new programming language, and I thought, well, I should build a website, do some databases. What do I know about Final Fantasy? Ironically, I made a website about Final Fantasy 12, even though it was not my favorite game at the time.
Right. Okay.
And then it just kind of spawned from there, really. The website started doing actually pretty well. Like people started coming to it because there was a lot of useful database information that wasn't really available anywhere else. Because we actually had the Final Fantasy 12 guide. We had digital cameras back then. We took a picture in the bestiary of every single enemy you could face in a digital camera, cropped them all up. It was we didn't have a scanner or anything.
Damn.
It's really old school, and we had this like massive chart of all the enemies. You could compare the stats of them all, the locations, all the stuff you get from them. Obviously, that stuff nowadays is readily available on like Wikia and stuff. But
yeah,
it was a really fun project. And then people started visiting the website, and originally it was called FFUnion because we wanted to kind of be all encompassing of the franchise in general, and everything they do, like Kingdom Hearts and all the other games that they were doing. And then we made the offshoot of Final Fantasy Union, which launched in 2008, I think.
Okay, so same year that my channel began.
Yeah, it's a long time ago now, right?
Yeah, it's a lifetime ago.
And then there was another website called FXN, FinalFantasy-xi.net, and I knew the owner of that from another community I'd been on for a while ago, and I ended up guesting on their podcast, and I got on really well with the guy who hosted their podcast, and we ended up merging the podcast to basically become the Final Fantasy Union podcast.
Okay, cool.
And like it just kind of went from there, really. But for the longest time, I mean, the website did okay. I mean, sometimes it would get maybe a couple of 100,000 impressions or views a month, but like it kind of died down when we had to focus more on like me going back to work, because I took about 2 years off of work to kind of build everything out. Like we founded a website called Gaming Union, which was more of like a generalist gaming publication. We went to E3, Tokyo Game Show, Gamescom a couple of times, and but like when I got married and had to go back to work, all that stuff went by the wayside. But we always made sure that Final Fantasy Union, the website, was ticking over with little pieces of news every now and again. And then we just all of a sudden decided that we had the podcast, we had the website, but we'd never done YouTube because we were always really scared about it. We didn't really know what it was or what we could do, what we could actually add to the conversation. And it was actually Final Fantasy Peasant who kind of inspired us to just get on with it, because he launched his channel out of just excitement for the 7 remake, and we saw what he was doing, and we were just like, you know what, let's just do it too. Let's just try and just do stuff. Like, it's what they always say about artists, right? You just got to do stuff. Stop being afraid about it all, and just get on with it. Just even if it's really bad, it doesn't matter. Just do something and just try and keep getting better all the time.
100%.
So that's my long story.
So you mentioned a few times going back to work, and then you mentioned music. Like, is your day job in like the music realm, or is it like web development stuff that you do?
It's not related to either of those two, really, actually.
Okay.
Weirdly enough, so when I wanted to be a programmer, I went to university to do computer science, and then my plan was to get into web development, which is why I was learning like PHP and ASP, JSP, and I thought that by building the website, so I'd get more familiar with the languages, so I'd become a more viable prospect for a company, because it's really hard to get into jobs because they want experience, but you don't have experience. So you've got to get your own experience, and it's just that really annoying situation. But the websites I was building started to actually do really well from like Google and search engines, and I started looking more into that. So I ended up getting into marketing, weirdly enough, or digital marketing.
Okay.
Just because my websites had done so well, and I was applying for like internships at digital marketing companies, and they were just like, well, if you've done all this by yourself, you should be able to do it for companies that aren't yours. So I kind of ended up getting into that, weirdly enough.
Okay, that's interesting. So you've pretty much always been a part of the Final Fantasy community from what I understand, from like a very long time ago. And it seems like your progression seems pretty natural in that sense to doing what you do now.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, like it's one thing has led to the other. It's a very strange thing as well, because Lauren also came in through it too. She ended up guest hosting on the podcast too, and I ended up meeting her through that, which is all crazy.
Okay, so she's someone that you met through the community as well.
Exactly, yeah.
That's awesome.
So pretty much every single aspect of my life is related to Final Fantasy. Specifically, Final Fantasy VIII, I'd say, had more of an impact on me in terms of my life than 7 did, but 7 was my first game.
Okay, you started with 7, cool. I mean, it obviously a lot of parallels in that sense with me and my Final Fantasy X experience. I'm a few years like behind in that sense. Like, I didn't really get into it until 2004, I think. 2004, 2005 was the first time I really got to play Final Fantasy X, and then obviously from there, like, my whole story began. But like the way it's changed both of our lives in that sense is just insane. And the fact that we're here today and able to do something like this, and hopefully, you know, have a few thousand people even listening to that, it's just crazy to me.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I always used to pinch myself, because with the podcast, and even now it's even weirder with how big the YouTube has become. But with the podcast, I used to get so nervous when we were recording it, because we might have a couple of thousand people listening to the show, and I was so worried about what I might say. And I'm listening back to my first episode. It's so cringeworthy to just think about how nervous I was about everything that was happening, and it really got in my head, especially towards the beginning, how many people were listening to what I was saying, and just worrying about it, trying to make sure I was really, really careful about everything I said. And weirdly enough, that has actually carried through to the YouTube channel, because like I always try to make sure I'm incredibly methodical, and I research everything to make sure that I don't make any mistakes. There's no comeback someone can have. If I'm doing a more of an opinion-based video, I want to make sure that I've explored both sides of the argument. I'm not just going forth with like just one perspective, just so that I've tried to make it so that everything's rationalized, and so that people can't really come for me. I guess it's always the worry, like you make some big mistake, and we do that sometimes, like especially in our evolution videos, because they're so expansive.
It happens, man. It happens.
Yeah, like it's always, sometimes it's the worst feeling. Like you put a video live and you've made a massive mistake, and it's just like, oh man, like how on earth did I do that?
Yeah, no takebacks.
And that's the bad thing about YouTube, right? You can't really edit anything.
No, you can't.
Like we've had it sometimes. I script things out. We did a recent video about Final Fantasy VII, and for some reason in my script I wrote that I meant to say that Final Fantasy VII was originally planned to be released on the SNES, but I actually said the PlayStation 2. And
right, okay.
And like I didn't catch it when I wrote it. I didn't catch it when I edited it to go through. I didn't catch it when I said it. I didn't catch it when I edited the audio. And then Lauren didn't catch it through her editing process either. It was only when we published the video and people were just like, what are you talking about? Like, that we were just like, oh man, that's a special one.
As they say, the internet is undefeated. They will always figure you out. Like even the slightest crack, the slightest mistake. It's one of those things I've had. I think for me, some of the funniest stuff with that is, again, we're very similar in that sense because I edit all of my playthroughs that I do. I mean, I don't think a lot of people really do that. They just tend to record like a session and then just literally just split it into chunks and just upload that and just not really look back on it. But I literally just rewatch and edit everything that I've played up until that point. And you know, if I've made a mistake, I'll either get rid of what I've said or I'll put an annotation in to correct me, like while I'm playing and all that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, I've made thousands of videos now, and it's just maths. Like you are bound. No one's perfect. You will make mistakes. And I think I was uploading Final Fantasy VIII, and for some reason, I can't recall why at this stage. It's been a few years now, but for some reason, I ended up uploading 2 episodes that were unedited. I think I was on a holiday, and I'd kind of like scheduled it or something like that. Like I didn't get a chance to check it properly, and the run times looked normal. So it's like a 32-minute video or something. And I thought, yeah, that's fine. And then I looked through the comments, and people were just like laughing their asses off in the comments at like some of the stuff that was going on. I was like, wait, why? And then I realized it was an unedited episode. And I think for me, especially because people are so used to the sort of more refined, edited sort of experience, they heard me, like, let's say I was burping while I was recording, I was drinking some water, I was doing this, that, and people were just having a massive laugh about it in the comments, like, this is ridiculous, like, this isn't the Dansg08 content we know and love kind of thing. And it was like banter, like, obviously it wasn't anything silly, but it was really embarrassing. Like, when I went through it, I was like, oh crap, like, I actually aired this to thousands of people. I need to go back in and like fix this because like this is wrong. And so yeah, I've had things like that.
That's definitely the thing. It's kind of that embarrassment because you want to make sure that everything you put out is the best it can be, and when you make those mistakes, it's nothing short of, it's just embarrassment. And yeah, sure, it's not the end of the world because ultimately we're making content about Final Fantasy. It's not.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like super serious stuff, but like we always want to have a degree of professionalism about what we do. And when those mistakes get left in there, it's just like, I guess it's that bit of vulnerability, isn't it? Like
yeah.
you're kind of showing another side to what you do that you maybe don't want people to see.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's just like I think it's just a testament to how seriously we try to take what we do, you know. And for me, like the way that I play is like with my Final Fantasy X playthrough, which is kind of what put me on the map. That was such a different experience to all the other Final Fantasies I played pretty much because I knew the game inside out when I played it, and it was kind of like a guide in video form. But I think what I like doing more these days is to show people that I'm not this sort of machine that knows everything there is to know about every game I play, and that I do stupid stuff. I make mistakes, I forget things, or you know, I do something wrong. And I think a lot of people, like they love to, some people love to kind of pick at that kind of stuff, but I always try to remind people, like, it's there for a reason. Like, if you're seeing something that you think makes me look bad, I've chosen to show you that, like, because I just want to show that that's a more authentic experience of how I play through the game and how I experienced it. And so I tend to enjoy that. Obviously, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because people see your flaws a bit more. They see you being silly. They see you making mistakes. Like, that didn't happen with the Final Fantasy X walkthrough. But like in the like the blind runs that I do now, I deliberately kind of do it that way, and I think it's more entertaining for the majority of people that watch.
I think it is interesting that you've said that though, in terms of that expectation that we know exactly what we're talking about all the time. And I think that's definitely something that Lauren and I have felt because we do put so much research into the content that we produce, and it's like, yeah, like I'd say that I have a probably above average knowledge of the franchise, but I don't know everything, and I have to research a lot to make sure that what I'm putting in there is interesting. And you know, I do make mistakes in some regards. I think one of the things I pride myself, especially when we do our facts videos, is that I really want to include things that most people would not know, literally would not know.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to your point about the fact we don't do kind of sensationalist headlines, we've always gone with the things you probably don't know. And I really make sure that it probably is things you don't know, because some of the things we put in those videos are things that literally Lauren and I are the only people that know, probably because it's a random interview we did with someone that no one else has ever spoken to, or like we just have like found a random Japanese interview. And yes, of course, there's still people that are, oh, I knew all of these things, and it's like, well,
Of course,
in some instances that's impossible.
Yeah.
But like because when we did our first one, I put in some facts, and like I for some reason I made it my objective to not include anything relating to the creation of the game. I only wanted it to be things relating to the actual gameplay of 7 that people didn't know.
Okay.
And so like some of the stuff I was like, oh, that's probably like stuff that maybe is a bit more or out there that perhaps people didn't know, and people were just like, oh no, like this is like really bad, like everyone knew all this stuff, and I was like, right, challenge accepted then, okay. and from that point on, generally the commentary has been like, oh, I came in expecting this to be like a video, like, because they're everywhere, right? Like when there's a new trailer that's come out, like, oh, things you didn't see and all those
Of
things,
course,
and
yeah.
like generally it's like the most obvious stuff on the planet.
Yeah.
So we've always tried to make sure that we are as well researched as possible, but there is the expectation that we know everything, and we've actually just started playing through the games on Twitch, and yeah, like people have appreciated the fact that we don't try and like it's not some like massive guide or walkthrough of us playing the game. It's like we're just having fun with it. Like we die, we make mistakes, we don't necessarily know where we're going all the time, like we have to look things up, and I think people appreciate that side of things, that we're not trying to say that we're better than everyone else. We're just fans too, and we just enjoy making content about this franchise.
100%. I think it definitely makes you more relatable in that sense as well. I think it's definitely the right way to do it. I've only done one things you might not know video, unsurprisingly, about Final Fantasy X, but I think with my one, again, my approach was similar to yours, but I did want to include some things that weren't sort of super obscure. And I think because people like us, we interact with so many people from the community, we get so many comments, and we speak to so many people. There were things that I knew about Final Fantasy X, but when I mentioned it to other people, they were like, wait, what? Like, that's a thing? Or like, they didn't understand. I mean, there's still so many people that don't even understand how Dreams Anakin and all these kind of things work in Final Fantasy X, that I didn't want to alienate too many people by going for like, this is the things that I reckon absolutely no one would know. So I tried to do like a bit of a mix, like different tiers of stuff that most people would know, and then some middle stuff, and then some stuff at the end. But I think ultimately that video did well, and
It's over like 1 million views, isn't it?
I think so. It's one of those. It's very tempting. Like you see a video like that, and then you're like, okay, let's quickly do the Final Fantasy VII one. Let's do the Final Fantasy 13 one. But it's just like with me, I find it hard to try and sort of, to me, when I create a video of that kind of nature, I need to feel like I'm an authority on the subject. And like when it comes to Final Fantasy X, yeah, I mean, my credentials are pretty clear. Like I know what I'm talking about with Final Fantasy X. But when it comes to the other games in the franchise, I'm much more of a newbie. You know, someone who's maybe only played through it once, maybe twice tops. I haven't done like big in-depth research into it and that kind of thing. So I didn't want to get into this thing of trying to become this sort of, know-it-all Final Fantasy guy that shares all of this information with people kind of thing. And it's another reason why I've not tried to make any lists of anything. So people ask me all the time, what's your favorite Final Fantasy? What's the best villain? Well, honestly, like, I don't feel qualified to answer that question because I still haven't played Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, for example. And so why would I try and create a list where I haven't played like 30-40% of the games in the franchise, right? So that's something that I've always tried to like wait until, let me actually complete the franchise from start to finish, and then maybe I can sort of zone in on more specific things, and then I'm in a more qualified position to talk about, certain aspects or rank things against each other or compare them and that sort of thing. So I've tried to stay away from that. But I mean, the type of content that you guys do in that sense, again, is very well researched. And, you guys, I think you deserve to be considered an authority on Final Fantasy in general. But of course, like you say, even with Final Fantasy X, for me, I forget so many things. Like if it's been a few years since I've done, let's say I did like a no sphere grid playthrough like 3 years ago. If I go back to it today, there's just so many things that I've forgotten about the game. And that's the game that I've been playing pretty regularly for the last 15 years, but you just forget, man. It's just how it goes.
Final Fantasy X though it's a pretty special game, and Laura and I were just talking about it because we just did a video talking about the the weird parallels that exist between Tidus and Seymour. And I don't know what it is about that game specifically, but like every single time you play it, you just see something different. Like there's no matter how many times you feel like you played 10, I don't know, more than any of the other games in the franchise, there's always an extra layer that you can uncover, something random or something unique that you see that you didn't see before, or some new way of looking at things that maybe you didn't appreciate before. And I can't think of any other game that has that in the same way. There's just something about 10 specifically that has such a great cast of characters, such a great lore and world. They managed to just really nail pretty much every aspect of everything relating to the game.
Preach. This is the kind of thing I want to hear.
I'm officially saying it's my favorite game in the franchise now. I used to teeter between 7 and 10, but I'm now fully in the 10 camp.
Okay, I can keep you on the podcast. That's good. I'm glad we agree on that. I mean, it's funny. Like, I totally agree with you on that stuff. Like, I was recently recording some content again for it. I'm trying to. I don't know if you've seen any of it, but I'm trying to work my way through the Japanese Ultimania content that's available in the books. And I was looking at. I think I was recording. It was a shot before the wedding scene, I think, and there's like an overhead shot of Bevelle. And it looks like an insect. I don't know if you've seen it in that way before. It looks like an insect almost. Like if you haven't seen it in that way before, like look at it again, and it strikes me as like an insecty kind of look. It looks like it has like multiple legs, and it looks like it has an insect head kind of thing. And then that made me think, well, Yu Yevon kind of looks like a bit of an insect tick kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, I wonder if that's some sort of link. You know, it's just that game where you're constantly. I don't know if it's because I've just played it too much at this point and my mind's just kind of making these random, probably unrelated links, but it's just that the game just does that to you. It has that quality where you see things every single time you play it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know like if they just struck gold with it for some reason, because obviously like 7 was more successful, it's more widely regarded, and something that's actually, I don't know if it's just it's not concerning me, but I have noticed it's a bit weird that has been a trend, especially in the last 10 years, that Final Fantasy X has been less adored. Like it's been, whenever people do their tier lists, which we've never done and probably never will do, but whenever people do their tier lists, it's been going lower and lower. And to show you the scale of my nerdism for the franchise, I actually did a study on this.
Okay.
Where I was looking at all of the major publications like IGN and GameSpot that have done tier lists for Final Fantasy and how their opinions have changed over the last decade or two. And like Final Fantasy X had been gradually lowering its position over the last decade. It used to be like generally top 4, and now typically it was, it could be like 8th or 9th in people's lists.
That's
and like
crazy.
Yeah, and like but it's because there's been this massive swell of positivity around 12, which was often really low in tier list because when it came out people didn't really like it that much, but it's people have started looking at it in a slightly different light. And 9 as well was one that was often quite low, but again it's 9 and 12 have been really highly regarded. History has favored them, but history has not favored the likes of 8 and 10 apparently.
That's really interesting. I think for me, it's difficult to be me as a person, and obviously the community that I've built around my channel. It's so Final Fantasy X centric that like that information, like I didn't know that was a thing. Like when you mentioned it, that's really interesting.
It's very strange, and I think a lot of it has to do with the laughing scene, because was so much negativity built around the laugh and how bad it is and cringeworthy, and most of that's from people that haven't played the game. They just they see that scene in isolation, and like we've all done it, right? Especially when you go on those old voice acting clips of like, especially in games like Shenmue and Dynasty Warriors, Resident Evil, the voice acting in those games was so bad sometimes. But if you take them out and you don't understand the context of things, it makes it so much worse. Like anyone who listens to that laughing scene just for that small like 10 seconds will think it's terrible. And if they listen to the Japanese one, it's even worse.
Yes, that's one thing I was going to mention. The Japanese one's even worse.
It sounds like a dead cat or something. And like, I don't know what they were thinking.
I don't know. It's one of those scenes I think it needed to probably be better directed. Like I get, like in hindsight, obviously, you're like when you think about it, you get what they were trying to achieve with it, but execution wise, I think it wasn't the best.
It's just one of those things where you think like because Nojima had like a really prominent role in that scene, and like he was always he like directed the voice actors and everything in the Japanese one. You would have thought that, yeah, sure, it sounds great on paper. When he heard that being delivered, him thinking, yeah, it sounds great, let's keep it in.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess we all have, like we've been mentioning already, we all have our kind of off days and just things that we just don't get right sometimes. And it happens to the best of us, I guess. Yeah, that was his day off. Like the day he approved that laugh, I guess, was just his day off. I don't
This
know.
is a shame because like 10 gets a really bad rap for its voice acting. I think it's really unfair because I've always thought the voice acting in 10 is really high quality.
Agreed.
And like there's not really anyone who does a bad job in that game, especially since it was the first one they'd done. And like one of the things we actually shared in our first fact video we did about 10, and I don't know if you'd watched that, but the voice acting was supposed to be very different. They were planning to do basically what they'd done for Kingdom Hearts and hire a load of Hollywood A-listers, and they'd hired two like really well-known celebrities to play Tidus and Yuna. But Jack Fletcher, who is the director, he shared with us that they actually he convinced the Square to go with basically no-name actors who were like really, really like hungry and keen for the role, and that they would then be able to build their careers around those roles because they would be so important. And so it wouldn't be that like Tom Cruise is playing Tidus. It would be Tidus is played by James Arnold Taylor, and James Arnold Taylor would then be able to say, "I'm Tidus, by the way, and this is who I am." And he still does now. Like it's still one of his biggest roles.
Absolutely.
And like
Yeah.
with 13, they did the same approach. And like at the time, Ali Hillis, Troy Baker, they weren't like household names. They were up and comers, but those roles really helped to cement them and propel their careers.
And I think, I mean, people talk about that, and when you look at the talent on paper, like as in who they are now, I mean, James Arnold Taylor, Tara Strong, and Samaggio, I mean, already like those three, these guys are like juggernauts of the voice acting, like video game voice acting industry. Like they're if you're making a game today and you have those guys like in the cast, like people are gonna be, oh yeah, this is gonna be a well voiced, like this is gonna be a great cast kind of thing. But for some reason, when it comes to Final Fantasy X, it's like, oh, some people think the voice acting sucked, and I think again, it's another case of like people pinpointing certain things and then sort of extrapolating that across the entire experience. So, you know, you have the laughing scene, you have, you know, the weird sort of speed issues where you have like with Yuna by my side and that kind of stuff. Like, okay, like I'm not going to defend those. I'm not going to say that, oh, that was great voice acting. But honestly, I think people just take those kind of things and just be like, well, yeah, I mean, how can you consider a game well voice acted if you've got things like this in it? But to me, it makes up such a small percentage of everything. And weirdly enough, I think Seymour's one of the most polarizing in that sense. I think Seymour's fantastic for that role. Like, I love his voice.
He's such a great villain.
He's brilliant. And like the people are, oh, his voice acting is terrible. I'm like, I genuinely don't understand. Like, why do you think that's the case? Like for the context and like his role and his weird look and like the way he's so, I don't know, like for him, he seems like he's got everything so figured out in terms of what he wants to do and why he wants to do it and his vision and all this kind of stuff. His voice has that, it carries that evil smugness. Like he knows exactly what he wants.
Exactly. Smug is the perfect word. It's like those little quips and one-liners he throws out. Like Laura and I were discussing it, that how like one of my favorite things is when Kimari like stabs him and he's just like, unpleasant.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, what of it? And that kind of thing. You know, he's brilliant. But another thing I think over the years that I've seen from like all the Final Fantasy I've uploaded is I'm pretty sure I'm yet to see a Final Fantasy game where I've not seen someone mention the fact that the voice acting is shit. It's happened on every single one. Like I've seen it on 12, I've seen it on 13, I've seen it on 15. I did a voice comparison between the English and Japanese voice cast of 15 before the game came out from the trailers, just for kicks, just to see what people would say. And the comments are just hilarious. Like It's literally like 30% of them are shitting on the Japanese one, another 30% is shitting on the English one. It's just like, for some reason, when it comes to voice acting, people just can't make their minds up. Everyone has this different. 7 Remake was the same. Some people were like, oh, Barrett's voice actor is terrible. Like, what the fuck? Are you kidding me? Like, that guy smashed it.
Yeah.
So I don't know,
I mean,
man.
7 Remake had its whole other dramas as well, with the old voice cast being canned, and
Yeah,
like the new guys really delivered. They did such a good job.
agreed.
But yeah, I completely understand. And like some other games have not helped themselves either. Like Lightning Returns was one that was really, really polarizing, because Ali Hillis, she was given that. Well, obviously, like it's in the context of the story, and that's what people don't necessarily understand with that game. Like she, when we interviewed her, she actually went to great lengths to explain why she had delivered the role in the way that she had, and it was because it was a purposeful choice. Like Lightning is, she's not the same Lightning anymore. She's changed, and like that, she was told to reflect that in the voice. So it's not like she just did a bad job or she just couldn't be bothered about the role. It was that this is
Yeah.
how Lightning is meant to be portrayed in this particular experience, because of everything that's happened, because of who she is.
Yeah, and she's literally lost a piece of herself. Like,
Exactly.
she is not the same person anymore. It's something that I reflected on while I was playing as well. I mean, I think while I was doing the playthrough, I kind of divided the two. So I talked about how much I enjoyed her narrations. Like, I really love her voiceover work and like her narrations of things that are happening. And then when it comes to scenes themselves, sometimes it's flat. But then obviously I went on to say that yes, it is flat, but when you look at it within the context of who she is now in the story, is it as entertaining to experience as as a player of the game? Probably not. But can I understand why the choice was made? Sure. But again, I think voice acting is one of those, is very, very subjective, and it really is hit and miss for a lot of people, I think.
It does show the difficulties, though, of the creators, because they could have just gone with the original Lightning and told Ali Hillis to do the original voice that people were expecting, but they chose not to and got criticized for it.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have someone like Cloud, where there's the whole misconception that Cloud's this depressed emo. He's really downbeat all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but that was never their intention. And like Nomula has gone on record with talking about how with Advent Children, they basically made him that character because that was what the consensus was that he should be. Like they didn't want him to be that way, but they thought that if they didn't make him this depressive, sullen, like guy who just mopes around everywhere, then people would be confused. And it's like, but why not just make the character that you want? Like if they didn't intend for him to be seen that way, then why make him that way? Like it's like this. He became this self-fulfilling prophecy, basically.
Yeah, I agree. I think when it comes to this stuff, probably, I guess, a lot of the times it's not to do with like voicing talent. It's more to do with directing. I was actually the other day, like, not about Final Fantasy for a change, but I was watching. They did a reunion of the Metal Gear Solid cast, the voice cast, with like David Hayter, Christopher Randolph, Paul Iding, Laurie Allen, and Jennifer Hale. Like, it was this massive kind of crew. And I was listening through, and literally every single one specifically took time to talk about the voice directing and Chris Zimmerman Salter, and what an incredible job she did, and like how so much of this wouldn't have been possible and it wouldn't have worked if it wasn't for her input and the way she directed us and that kind of thing. So it does seem to me like it plays a really huge role.
Oh yeah,
in
it's
how
huge.
these things work.
I mean, we used to interview voice actors all the time. So we interviewed like the entire cast of 13 through the 3 games, and we interviewed pretty much the entire cast of Type 0 as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like it's one of the big things that changed with Lightning Returns as well in terms of the story direction, or alongside the story direction, was that the director changed, and instead of it being Jack Fletcher, they had the voice director for Gears of War.
Okay.
So like a very different experience coming into it. Jack had obviously worked with the Final Fantasy franchise for years at that point. He'd done like 10, 10-2, The Spirits Within, 13. I think he might have done 12 as well. So he had like tons of experience, and then they replaced him for the last game in the 13 series. But also like Type 0, I mean, that is one game where I probably would say the voice acting is a bit suspect, because they had such a range of people. There were lots of people that it was their first ever voice acting gig. They'd never done it before. But then you also had like professionals who had been doing it for years, like Matt Mercer and Orion Akaba, who like you can tell the characters who knew what they were doing and didn't really need the direction.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell the ones that were probably a bit more green around the ears and could benefit from the direction. But also in that game, it's one of those ones where you get those inconsistencies because they didn't really know what the characters were supposed to be called because it was very Japanese focused still. They didn't have a proper localization process. So like Kurasame is one of the big ones because half the time the characters call him Kurasame and half the time they call him Kurasame. Like it's really inconsistent with like character names. They don't say them the same. They don't like it's such a weird game to play in that regard.
Yeah, honestly, when people do ask me about like which Final Fantasies do I like the best, I tend to say that I've liked every Final Fantasy I've ever played. There hasn't been a Final Fantasy that I haven't liked, but of the ones I did play, the one I liked the least was Type 0. I would
Really?
say. I think so. Yeah. I mean, honestly, if you ask me to explain why at this stage, I think it's been 4 or 5 years now since I played it, and because I never ever went back to it, it's just I don't even remember that much from the experience anymore. It just didn't grab me for some reason. It just didn't do it for me. I don't really have an in-depth reasoning for why, but it didn't hit right for me.
Did you play the HD version?
I did, yeah. I think that's why I played it. I think it was re-released for PS4 or something, and that's the version I played.
I do think that was a big part of the problem because obviously it was originally designed for the PSP, and
Yes.
they ported a PSP game to high definition consoles, which it was never intended to do. And so like there are issues in that regard, like game design. It was planned to be a pick up and play game, not like a sit down play it on your big screen TV experience.
Yeah.
Issues with the camera, stuff like that, definitely there. But I felt that like if you could look past though like the presentation issues, like it was a really solid game. Like the story was pretty strong in a lot of parts, and especially the ending was a killer. Absolutely brutal.
Yeah, it was a brutal game. I do remember that. Like that was a part of it that was memorable for me.
It got me really excited about 15. Honestly, I think obviously Tabata did Crisis Core before that, but Type 0, the way he executed it, and like Lauren was so funny because I was playing it kind of review like really early, and when we do that, like we have to take turns, so she can't play the game until I've finished.
Sure,
and
yeah.
So she hadn't really paid any attention to it, but she watched the ending and she just was sitting there bawling her eyes out, and I was like, you don't even know what's happened, and it's affected you this much. But I also like the fact that like there was so much diversity with the cast of characters and the gameplay styles too. Like I've never really spoken to anyone like you can't if you ask people what their preferred 3 characters are, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who's picked exactly the same 3 as you.
Yeah, I think
I feel
agree.
as though that was a really really big selling point for the game. They just had that they incorporated the jobs in such a well crafted way, and I feel as though like with the gameplay the way it was, whereby like if your character that you were playing as or you mained died, then you went to the next one, and like it kind of forced you to get to learn to play these characters, which is what I feel some of the games don't like. 7 Remake, I had a real bugbear in about that because like everyone wants to play as Cloud for sure. He's the main character. Everyone's going to just focus on him. They'll learn him. The game doesn't push you to play as Barrett, Aerith, or Tifa really. Like there's 2 really small segments where you play as Barrett solo and Tifa and solo. So by the end of the game, I basically didn't use Aerith at all. I didn't get on with her. I thought she was a waste of space. In my review that I did, I basically said that the game was really unfair on her because like when I did hard mode, I played with her a bit more purposefully and started to learn more about how to use her, the strengths of her kind of move set, and which situations you'd use her in. But in my normal playthrough, like I wasn't pushed to do that, so I had a really negative view of her gameplay.
Okay.
And like with Type 0, like that whole process of like, okay, here's my character I feel like I'm really good at. Oh no, they've gone now. I've got to still try and make it through this encounter. Now I've got to learn how to exploit the positives of this character instead of this one. And like then like gradually as I kept going through that, then I'd start to maybe I like this character a bit more, and maybe I'll put a bit more time into that one. I ended up with my main 3 as being King, Jack, and Deuce, which are like King was the double gun shooter, Jack was the samurai, and Juice was the bard. Like what an odd combination.
Yeah,
Like, but they just worked for me for some reason.
that's interesting. I think, like you say, a challenge that not a lot of Final Fantasy games do great on, I think, is trying to keep the entire party relevant, like in terms of gameplay. And well, I mean, Final Fantasy X is a good example of how they're not that great at it. Where later on in the game, magic starts to become more obsolete. A lot of people struggle to keep Kimari involved gameplay wise. You kind of get stuck and left by the wayside.
Yeah, I don't think anyone uses Kimari.
Not really, yeah. And I mean, once you really get to post game, there's just like Tidus Wakariku becomes like your de facto sort of ultimate damage dealing giant killing party, and they take over. So most recently, I was playing Final Fantasy VI, and I'm almost at the end of the Dragon's Den dungeon for the GBA version. And I think one thing that they just did incredibly well was how they managed to keep the entire cast involved in the gameplay. So there were like multiple points in the game, obviously, as you know, where it forces you to use 3 different sets of teams, for example. And so you have to play as everybody, you have to invest time in everyone and get to use their moves and that kind of thing. And considering how giant the cast was, I mean, of the mainline Final Fantasy games, it surely has the biggest cast, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, so to have that big a cast and I mean, Final Fantasy had like, 7 characters or something, and they couldn't manage it, but Final Fantasy 6 had like 12, and you could pretty much use all of them.
And 6 had 15, actually.
Yeah, it was like a huge number. If you include like the optional characters as well, it's just a huge number. So I was very impressed by how they did that in that game.
But it did come at the cost of there being so many characters, and it was like, from a story perspective, they really struggled to make them relevant.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, that's another thing that I commented on. It was, I just liked that. I liked that it was a different approach from some of the stuff that I was used to, because they loved, like, as you move further on, especially even with 7. Things got so much deeper and like so much more backstory and the arcs and everything. But 6 was kind of it was much more shallow because they had to split it across so many more characters. But in my personal experience, I did find their stories engaging and kind of interesting, even though they were short. I think they did a lot with a little in that game, and that's something that I really enjoyed Final Fantasy 6 voice. But it ended up being one of my favorites of the Final Fantasies I've played.
I think it did. Yeah, it did really excel at because there wasn't that central focus on a single character. They managed to have each character have their own tangents, and weirdly enough, it's something that I feel they try to do with 13, because even though Lightning is the main character, everyone pretty much gets their own screen time. And when we were actually running through Lightning's story, she's not really the central figure. Like, she's the poster child for the game, sure, but then the actual narrative, she's not really the leader. She kind of like takes a back seat a lot of the time, and unlike some of the other games like 7, like everyone always looks to Cloud to say something or to do something. With 13, like when all 6 of them are there, often she wouldn't say anything. It would be all the other characters discussing, and she'd just kind of fade into the background. And then once the conversation's moved on and it's down to like 2 or 3 people, she might have a quiet word with Snow or something behind everyone's back. But often she just kind of was there, like, but everyone had to have their little moment.
Mm-hmm.
But their moments were like, it was a duo moment. So like Lightning had her thing with Hope, and then Snow had his thing with Hope, and like Fanil and SARS had their moment. But I think it made it harder because their story arcs were like really self-contained, whereas in 6 their story arcs were related to stuff that happened in the past, like people they met along the way, like NPCs they interacted with, like they brought other people in that built the world out. Like Sabin has his like mentor and his rival that like, it's just that small little tangent. It has nothing to do with any of the other playable characters, but it helps to build him out.
Yeah, I think structure-wise, I think Final Fantasy VI did it so well in that sense as well. I mean, I loved the way the second half of the game starts in the world of Ruin, and you start on your own with Celes, and you're going to go on this mission around the world and collect basically the rest of your team. And in doing so, you find out so much more about all of their stories and all that kind of stuff. I thought it was just so brilliantly executed. And Final Fantasy 13 definitely, in that sense, was nowhere near like as well done, unfortunately.
I do have an interesting factoid on that, actually. With 6 in the World of Ruin, they they made a really conscious decision. I was actually just researching this the other day. They made a really conscious decision not to have it start with Terra, because they felt that if they did start it with Terra, then she would be considered the main character. And
Okay.
so they chose to have it be Celes so that you could meet Terra and she would have her story arc, the stuff that she's been doing behind the scenes that you're not aware of. And then that kind of diminished her role.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that definitely sounds like a deliberate move. I think it was ultimately, I think it was a good idea. I mean, people look to 12 and say like they had 12 had a protagonist problem, and like, well, on paper, six should have had a protagonist problem, but I don't really see anyone saying, well, six didn't feel like it had a protagonist or anything like that. They found a way to really make it work. I think with
Yeah.
12 they didn't do as good a job with that, but I think with
It's
six
weird though, right?
they
Because
nailed it.
they've tried the ensemble cast when they've had less people in the cast, and it just hasn't seemed to work as well.
Yeah.
Because like four obviously had an ensemble cast as well in a way.
Well,
Um,
I'll stop you there. I know nothing about 4 and 5, so I haven't played them yet. So I'm trying not to be spoiled on if there's any spoilers.
I mean, Cecil is very much the main character, but like it's a similar system to six in terms of like they have people coming in and out of the party all the time, so you get
Okay.
to know different people and their move style, play styles and stuff. But
Hmm.
they all have their they all have their moment, their time to shine as such. But it was like the first time they were really doing it and telling a proper story. So yeah, sure, it's way better than like 1, 2, and 3. But like you compare the story of 4 to 6, and it's very immature in terms of where their skill sets were at.
Okay. I think Final Fantasy. I think a great Final Fantasy game does have to have that sort of. They always try to do it. Everyone gets their moment thing in the Final Fantasy stories, and I think some games do that better than others. Like 10, I think is one of the things that they do best. Like everyone, like Kimari, it doesn't matter how much you forget about him in the story. The guy literally has like such a well defined arc and such a great progression from literally just like ignoring you, like grunting at you, and then eventually smiling at you, then dropping wisdom, then taking on his own demons, being Barana Yenke, and he's so well written and so well done.
Yeah, and he says like it says like 10 words in the entire game, but those 10 words are meaningful.
Exactly, yeah. Almost everything he says is a quote, right? He's such an underrated character, but I mean, I've always had love for him. But even saying that, like gameplay wise, unfortunately, I've never really used him that much. In No Sphere Grid, he has a bit more utility because of his higher HP, but nothing special really, unfortunately.
No. He was like one of those unfortunate characters they kind of just put in there to he had a really important role to play in the story, but yeah, like gameplay, it was just kind of a mishmash of things. And they were like, "Oh, we got to have a blue mage in there somewhere." Yeah, Kamari will do.
Yeah, it did have that vibe a bit, but like I say, I think I liked his story enough like that. He's still one of my favorites. He's great. We talked a little bit about Final Fantasy IV. It's actually something I think you'd be a good person to ask. I'm working my way back on the Final Fantasy game, so next I need to play Final Fantasy V once I'm done with this. And I'm told that for Final Fantasy V, like I did for 6, the Game Boy Advance emulated version is probably a good way to play Final Fantasy V. But for Final Fantasy IV, there's people that say to me, well, I think it was remade, I think, for the 3DS or the whatever it is, and apparently that's meant to be like an objectively better version of playing it. But I'm like, but shouldn't I still play the original anyway? What do you think?
So, I mean, weirdly enough, we just did a video about this because I think Final Fantasy IV holds the record as being the game that has been re-released and remade the most in the entire franchise.
Wow.
I think there's about 12 or 13 different versions of the game,
My God.
and each of them is actually quite different from the others. It's super weird, and so the two kind of quote unquote best versions of the game are like the PC version and the PSP version, essentially.
Hmm.
And I say that because they're the best versions of their paths. So the PSP version can kind of trace its lineage all the way back to the original SNES version. It's like been iterated on. So there was like the SNES version, then there was the easy type, then there was a North American version. Then the PlayStation version kind of blended those three versions into one and took different parts, but then redid all the localization of it. They've all got different difficulties as well. which is weird. So they felt that the original Japanese release was way too hard. So they
Okay.
re-released it in Japan as easy type to make it much easier for people to get through. And they also made the language easier to understand as well, because they felt like the script was too needed too high of an education to get to grips with for the
Okay.
Japanese public. They made so the easy type is the easiest version. North American one isn't as easy. PlayStation version, they kind of tweaked things a little bit, but that's when they added like cutscenes and stuff. And then there was the Wonder Swan version, which was a redone version of the SNES one, the Game Boy Advance version, and then the PlayStation Portable one is basically the enhanced version of the Game Boy Advance version.
Okay.
So it has like really, really crisp. It's basically got the same kind of visual style as the Final Fantasy 1 and 2 20th Anniversary Edition. So like it's really, really crisp HD 2D. Like the magic, like we were playing, we just finished playing on stream actually, and like everyone was just blown away by how amazingly good quality like the spell animations are, the summons that look amazing when you summon them in. Like Titan is just so epic. Like this massive chasm appears in the floor and he jumps out of the chasm and like crashes down on the ground. Like it's so cool.
Wow.
The weird thing that comes out of it though is that basically when they were making the original SNES version, they had to cut content out of the game because they just couldn't fit it in for memory purposes. So they've kind of tweaked things in the localization as they've gone through to allude to certain things. But the 3D version reinserted a lot of the cut content.
Right. Okay.
So in there's like a backstory about Cecil, like as a kid and stuff that isn't in the base game. So it's like the PSP version is the prime version of the original Vision, I guess, or the original release, whereas the 3D version, which I think was actually directed by the guy who wrote the original script, he kind of it's basically a reimagined version of the game. So it's the same story, but they've put in like the dialogue is basically completely different.
Wow.
And there's new scenes in there to help build out the backstory. It's a longer experience, and it's also like rock super
Really?
hard. Yeah, to the
Wow.
point where when they released it on iPhone, they added a new difficulty, and the normal difficulty of the DS version became hard mode
Well,
in the iOS version and PC version.
that's interesting. It sounds to me like what you're saying from this is like play the PSP version as your first Final Fantasy IV experience, and if you really love it, then play the DS version to see how it's been like changed and refined and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd probably go along with that. Because like
Okay.
even the DS version also added new content as well. So like it's weird because so the PSP version has all the extra content from the Game Boy Advance. There's like Lunar Ruins at the end, extra dungeons, extra items, all these extra stuff in there. That was all taken out of the DS version, but they
Oh,
added in a new bonus dungeon instead that replaced it.
bloody
And there's
hell. Okay.
also there's like a unique summon called Wit that you can use. There's like stylus controls if you're playing on the DS. There's all these mini games that you can play that to help level up the Eidolon Wit. Like, but then they removed that summon from the iOS and PC version because I guess they figured that the motion controls weren't there anymore. But they could have just redone it.
That's interesting. I had no idea there were that many different. Already 6 was kind of confusing for me already with its different versions, but 4 just seems way worse.
Yeah, it's all over the place, and it still baffles me to this day that they didn't release the 2D version as like the PC version, and they went with the 3D version.
Yeah, I've been wondering about that. I've been talking about that with people as well. Like their decisions on what games to like port and remake and remaster. It seems a bit weird sometimes. Like 6 seems so well loved, and the fact that there isn't like a definitive edition of 6 just still strikes me as very odd.
It's so weird with their ports because like with 4, so they did the After Years, and that was a mobile game originally. And then when they were releasing 4 on the PSP, they remade the After Years to look like the 2D like PSP version they were making.
Okay.
And then when they released Final Fantasy 4 on the phones, iOS and Android, they remade the After Years in 3D. And it's like, but they already had a complete version of the 2D stuff that they'd done for the PSP that they could have just ported over but they were like, no, we're gonna remake the game again in 3D this time. Why?
That's so strange. Like, is it like some super big hit in Japan or something? Like, is it the Japanese like greatest Final Fantasy or something? Why?
I don't know. I don't know why they've gone for the 3D as their kind of main canonical version of everything. Like it's also weird as well because like Final Fantasy 3 never really had a 2D remaster in the same way. Like you can only really play the 3D version now of that game.
Hmm.
And they were planning to do a PSP game, but it got cancelled. And I think they were planning to do a Wonder Swan version as well, but that got cancelled. So there's 1, 2, and 4 that have exist in that format, and then like 5 and 6 as well got the advanced. But I don't think 3 ever did get any re-release on in 2D.
Wow.
I may be wrong there though.
Okay, right. I mean, like I said, once you go back beyond 7, it gets a bit confusing with like all these releases and versions and what content is in this one, which localization version is in this one, and all this kind of stuff. It
All
does
I
seem like
know
a bit of
is
a
that
minefield.
most people despise the current versions available of 5 and 6 because of the sprites.
Yeah, on Steam, everyone's just like, yeah, do whatever you want to do, but don't play the Steam versions. They suck.
Yeah.
For some reason. I mean, again, even that's just ridiculous. Like, come on. Steam is one of the most like accessible, well-known, easy to obtain thing for these Final Fantasy games. Why would you have such a subpar version on there? Just it's weird.
And
It
it's like
really is.
those things just print the money as well. Like I think like 6 has sold like 1 million copies or like 500,000 copies on Steam or something crazy. Like you couldn't just invest in some decent art.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. I don't know. It's one of those things that I've talked to a bunch of people and we haven't really come up with a reasonable explanation for why it's the way it is.
it's Square. That's the only explanation you need. Nothing they do ever really makes sense.
Yeah, I think, especially with you saying that as well, I think that's the final word when it comes to the weirdness of the Final Fantasy remasters and remake situation. But I want to continue down that vein, and more recently there was this news about certain trademarks or something that Square Enix have gotten, and people got excited about what this means for potentially Crisis Core or Zack in the next remake game. What's your take on all of that business?
Are we going spoiler free?
Yeah,
Spoilers all good.
yeah, yeah. Crisis Core, I haven't played. I know what happens to Zack in the end, obviously, but I haven't played Crisis Core as a game. But like
I mean
in
spoilers in
general,
terms of remake as well.
for remake, I don't mind. I think pretty much everyone listening to this would have played the remake at this stage.
I mean, Crisis Core, I guess, like, there's not really too many spoilers because, yeah, like, you already know based on 7 what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I like it's interesting actually because there was an interview that came out. I think it was like 4 years ago in the 30th anniversary year. And Guitazi was talking about how they wanted to build out this new expansive compilation basically for the 7 remake. And they were referring to like the 15 team and what they did and how they were going to try and learn from it because the 15 universe was kind of a disaster. um, so like yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, the cool thing for me is that there's a whole thing like the alphabet naming. I don't know if you know about that, where like with the compilation, every single property keeps continuing up in the alphabet. So you got Advent Children, Before Crisis, Crisis Core, Dirge Cerberus. And then they did events in Mobius that began with E and F.
Okay.
But obviously, like the two properties they trademarked are also E and F because you've got Ever Crisis and the First Soldier.
Yep.
So yeah, it's hinting at them being like some properties of substance relating to the 7 remake.
Mm-hmm.
As to what they are, who knows, right? I mean, chances are like Square love their mobile games. It would not surprise me if they release some kind of mobile game relating to 7 remake because 15 had like 10 of them.
That's true. Yeah.
And they are making them so much money. It's ridiculous. I think like especially even like lesser franchises, like they released a Saga mobile game, and that's generating them like 100 million a year or something.
That's insane.
The Dragon Quest games in Japan are absolutely huge. Like I mean, you think like Brave Exvius is massive,
Hmm.
but like Dragon Quest Tact and Dragon Quest Walk absolutely trounce on them. So
Wow.
if they can make like a 7 remake game that is as decent, hopefully it's not like a New Empire if they do make one. But if they can make one that's decent, then that would just make them so much money.
Yeah, it sounds like a reasonable guess. Are you into the mobile games at all? Have you ever played them? I'm not a mobile game guy myself. I've never tried any of them myself.
Yeah, not overly. I've tried to give them a fair shake, but like they're so insidious in how they operate with the gacha
Mm-hmm.
concept.
Mm-hmm.
The nicest one that they've done is Opera Omnia because it doesn't force it down your throat. You can play that game for free with like literally no penalization really at all.
Okay.
Whereas like Record Keeper, Mobius, Brave Exvius, and War of the Visions, they really are like if you want to progress in that game and do really well, then you're basically going to have to spend money.
Right. Okay. I mean, the only thing I've seen of the mobile games is when they had that little Final Fantasy X story for Mobius. Obviously, a lot of
Yep.
people wanted me to check it out, and I was curious because it's you don't get any kind of new story, whether it's canon or not. You don't really get much new story for 10. So I did want to check it out, and I think I just watched someone else's like compilation of the cutscenes or something, but I've
It's
never
hard
played it.
because like with the mobile games there's two distinct audiences, so they have the Japanese audience and they have the global audience.
Hmm.
And like with Opera Omnia again, they've done it quite well because the Japanese game always comes first, and when it gets released to the rest of the world, they you're playing the same game but like a year behind
Right.
sometimes, or 6 months behind. And with Mobius, they stuck to the same rigid schedule. So Lauren and I started playing it when it first came out, and we were having fun. The story was decent. It was probably the best story we'd had in a Final Fantasy mobile game. Although I think a lot of people like Brave Exvius' story, but it just kind of came to, like we finished the first chapter or whatever first season, and then it was like, well, you've got to wait like 2-3 weeks for the next story drop. It's like I don't want to wait 2 or 3 weeks for doing some like stupid side quest that is just benign. Like it's just whereas Opera Omnia they realized that they had all this content blocked up. Like the Japanese people had to wait for some period of time, but the global audience didn't need to. Why would they need to?
Hmm.
Because it would take them so long to catch up, even if they sped up the cycle. So they were just pumping content out all the time, like new characters, new story, new side quests, like new items all the time, and they never really made it feel like you had to pay for it. We ended up actually quitting because we were playing it too much and to the detriment of other things.
Sure, that makes sense. So where do you see Final Fantasy Remake going? How's your feel about the progress of the remake?
Um, I I'm curiously optimistic. I'm gonna say. I think when I finished the game, I initially was kind of just stunned as to what was even going on,
Yeah.
and I finished at like 2-3 o'clock in the morning, I think, and I was so wiped out at that point in time. I just couldn't really comprehend what was going on, and then I slept on it, and I woke up, and I was just like, "This is genius." They're evil geniuses, and I know that it's going to really annoy some people, but ultimately, it's like the only thing they could really do
Yeah.
because like they knew like it because they've split it into parts. They had to do something to get people like us interested in what's going to come next
Sure.
beyond just what we know about the story. So now we've got the same curiosity about the next part that we had with the first part in terms of, oh, I wonder how they're going to do that. Like I think half of us were kind of expecting the first part to be some kind of a train wreck because we just didn't. We had literally no idea how it was going to turn out because they didn't really show us anything other than parts of the opening bombing mission.
Yeah.
And like with the second part, like we've still got that curiosity of okay, how are they going to kind of improve what they've done? Where are they going to go in the story? How are they going to do certain scenes? That's still there, but now we've got the other tangent of, but what are they going to do with that? Like, are things going to change? That's a
Yeah.
potential now. We don't know what's going to change. So
Hmm.
they've kind of sucked us in because now we're going to want to play the game because we're going to want to see how different it's going to be.
Yeah. I had a similar experience as you in that sense because I got the game about I think 9 or 10 days before release. So of course I had to sort of crank out the content, I had to get cracking with it, and I finished it quite late night as well. And really, like up until the final hour, it's kind of it was just I really really loved everything that was happening, really really enjoying the game, and the final hour just kind of it threw me for a loop because everything just changed so dramatically at the end, and I knew it because obviously you get like Square Enix sends you the NDAs and like all the review
Yep.
instruction stuff, and it's like do not talk about chapter 18, and I was like oh shit, like chapter 18 clearly there's some shit happening in chapter 18 if that's what they're saying, and I played through it and I think it was a mix because on the one hand I was like this is exactly what should have really happened in a sense because well what are you going to do you can't end it the same way that you ended the Midgar section of the first game. It's just not what you're going to do. You're just going to have like some shitty battle after the motorcycle race and then that's it. Like you needed a Final Fantasy finale regardless because it's a full price game, it's a full length experience, it's going to be years before the next one. You need to end it on like a Final Fantasy style like big boss battle and Sephiroth shows up and all that kind of stuff. So it didn't surprise me in that sense. But when I sort of like afterwards, when the whole like, but wait a minute, does this mean that the entire story could potentially change? Then that was like I had a bit of like an existential crisis when that hit, and I was like, surely not. Like that's how when it was all said and done, that's kind of how I concluded it. I was like, surely they cannot change the story in like a serious way. My kind of final feeling about it, not really based on sort of very heavy research and analysis, but more based on feeling and conversations I've had and stuff, is that I feel like, yeah, of course, it's not going to be identical to the story that we know from here on, but the general skeleton will probably be the same. I still feel like, what happens to Aerith and that kind of stuff, it will still happen, but maybe it will happen in a slightly different way, and maybe they'll integrate different elements of the Final Fantasy VII universe into it in a way that they didn't previously, but that's obviously just pure speculation at this point.
Yeah, I mean that's all we have, right? I'm very much feeling the same way that it's similar theory to the like alternate dimension kind of thing where I mean like Laura and I are playing Life is Strange at the moment and it's the same thing, like change the timeline, same things are happening, but there's different things happening at the same time. And like they're going to still have the same big touch points that they had in the original game, but the way it plays out is going to be very different.
Yeah, that's the feeling that I get. I mean, I personally don't. I didn't subscribe to the more like radical things that people were saying could be happening. These time travels and Zack's going to be alive now and this kind of thing. To me, it just seemed like too giant a deviation from what Final Fantasy VII should be. I mean, if that's the case, it feels like it should be. Even with this, there was a lot of debate about like, well, what even is a remake? And for me, like the way I see it quite simply, if you're remaking Final Fantasy VII, to me the primary thing should be to remake the Final Fantasy VII from 1997 into a 2020 2021 game, right?
Yeah.
But some people are like, well, if it's a remake, that should give people the license to reimagine the story and make it different. And I'm like, yeah, but then you're making a different game. Like,
Yeah, it's not the same game anymore. But then I guess it's hard because like we were talking about Final Fantasy IV, right? And the DS version is a remake of 4, and they used the opportunity to change the story. They inserted new things into it, and I feel as though that's kind of what they've done with the 7 remake. Like there is so much kind of left on the cutting room floor that we know nothing about. Like
sure,
like 7 has probably one of the most extensive archives of dummied content out of any game out there, and some of that stuff has resurfaced. Like we know they wanted to spend more time like building out Johnny in the original game, like they just couldn't do it.
yeah,
And like I feel as though a lot of the stuff that's in there is stuff that they planned and they just didn't have time because like I mean Zach's probably one of the best examples of that because even though he was thought up towards the end of the development of 7, Nojima and Nomura, they'd already like come up with like massive backstory about the character and everything. So like Crisis Core had basically already been written. They just didn't ever think they were going to do anything with it.
mm-hmm.
And then obviously when they had the opportunity to do Crisis Core, they had a lot of it built out already, but they didn't put any of that in the original game. And I feel as though that's the same for a lot of the characters, like the stuff with Vincent and Hojo. Like I'm it's unlikely that they just popped that out of thin air for Dirge of Cerberus. Like Nojima was like the primary consultant for writing that game. Like he would have had all these ideas behind the scenes when they were coming up with the original one, and they just didn't have the chance, or it just got cut or whatever. Like Vincent and Yuffie had tons of stuff that was planned for them that just got cut from the original game. They just ran out of time.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I feel as though that the remake, because it's all the original people working on it again, I feel as though it's given them a chance to tell the story they weren't able to tell in the first place. But people don't realize that because they don't know what the original story was supposed to be, and none of us do. Only they do.
Yeah. I mean, again, I was looking at there was an interview with Kitase before the game came out, and one of the things that sort of aggravated me a little bit about it was that once the game was out and everything was done, I think people got so excited by how sort of open-ended the ending was that all the theorists got to work, and people were going into deep dives and checking out all this stuff. Oh, this is linked to that, and coming up with wacky theories and stuff about how the story is going to radically change, and we're in a whole different dimension. We're in a whole new story now. And I went back to that interview and I was like, yeah, but Kitase literally talks about the fact that the remake is a chance for them to translate everything that they did previously into like a new experience. And for me, it was like, the way I read that was that he's saying that everything that we had previously, and that can also include, like you say, the stuff that they never even got to put in, this is going to be our opportunity to tell the definitive edition, the definitive version of the story that we came up with like all those years ago. So that's why when I see all of this stuff, to me, it just, hopefully it is the case that it's not a radically new story. It is just the definitive, more expanded the version of the Final Fantasy VII story that they wanted to tell. Because
it's just hard because Kitase, like, he'll say something one time and then he says something else completely different the next time. Like, we're going to keep this as consistent as possible, but there might be changes, guys.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm not one of these people where like it has to be identical to the first, like to the original game. Like I want every single line of dialogue to be the same or whatever. Because I mean, looking at Remake Part 1, they turned like a 6-hour section into like this 30, 35, 40-hour story that I really enjoyed like throughout. And the stuff that they added, like, stuff like meeting Jesse's family and like all of this extra stuff about those guys, I thought that was all really well done. I really enjoyed that stuff. So like you, I mean, overall, I think my view on it is definitely positive. Literally the only thing I think that could upset me, initially at least, is if the story truly has changed in some radical way, and it has become a new story and it's deviated from the Final Fantasy VII story that we know. But I'm doubtful that that's the case.
I mean, I am slightly worried because I think it came out that Kitase was like really pushing them to change things like radically, and Nomura was the one saying like, no, let's not do that. Let's try and keep it like pretty traditional. And like all of the new people that were joining the staff that didn't work on the original game were fans of the original, so they were pushing for it to be kept as like traditional as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But like kind of like more of the old heads were like, well, we already made that game. We don't want to make that game again. Let's just do something different. Let's do something crazy. And that's why like they had Sephiroth featuring so heavily, because they were like, well, everyone already knows that Sephiroth's going to be in the game, but we can't not have him in the first part. So like the whole like I guess ideology behind his existence in the first game doesn't work anymore because everyone knows who he is now.
Mm-hmm.
And like anyone who's anyone in video gaming pretty much knows Sephiroth. And there will be all these people going into the game thinking like, well, he's supposed to be the bad guy. Where is he?
Yeah. That's why, like I say, I mean, when it came to that stuff, it didn't really surprise me. People were like, oh, the way Sephiroth's been introduced and like featured in this game is so different. I'm not sure I like it. And I was like, sure, like, if the remake was a single game and not multiple parts, then yeah, I agree with you. But I felt like, for the release schedule that they have and the way they want to make the game, it kind of felt inevitable that they had to write him in this way for the first part.
It's also interesting as well because when we were going back and rewatching a lot of the Midgar sequence from the original game, although Sephiroth doesn't physically appear, Cloud does have lots of like mental breakdowns and stuff, and we obviously don't see what's happening during those. Mm-hmm. But within the remake, they got the chance to show more about what he's actually experiencing, what he's seeing, like these hallucinations and stuff. And I feel as though like it's really their chance to show the story they wanted to show originally. And something else that Nojima said as well that really resonated with me, especially because we've done so many kind of the origin videos where we like really go deep into the story and like try to understand the different character motivations and what they're thinking and feeling at the time and why they're doing certain things. He said that one of his biggest concerns about the remake was that within the original games, all the games that were text based and didn't have voice acting, it was really hard for them to, especially with the older ones where the graphics were what they were, really hard for them to show like the correct intent for the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So you could be watching an interaction between like Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett, and you interpret it one way, and then I might look at that scene and interpret it another way. And like back in those days, like there are so many different ways you can interpret character interactions and get different inference from like how people are feeling or the characters are feeling about each other or why they're doing certain things. Once they introduced voice acting, they were able to control that a lot more. And he was really worried that with the remake that they would have characters say and do things in a certain way that did not marry up with their expectations based on what they thought was happening in the original game.
Another thing that I thought about during this whole process was that there's like an angle where you're thinking, well, when it comes to anything to do with the story and how they want to change it and that kind of thing, these are the guys who are the original storytellers. It's their story. They're the ones that created it. It's obviously their right to do whatever they want with it. It's not up to us to tell them what to do with their story or anything like that. That's one way to look at it. But then, on the other hand, I was thinking, well, for something as huge as Final Fantasy VII that's been out for so long and that's been played by so many millions and loved by so many millions, is it really like to what it's also not just their story, it's our story too, and it's loved and adored by so many millions in the current form that it's in, that to what extent is it fair for them to, let's say, make radical changes to the story and sort of betray the story that so many of us know and love? Because I mean, that they've given us that story. It's out there. It's been out there for so long, and been enjoyed by so many for so long, that I do think if it is like a truly radical change, I think that could really, that's going to cause some fireworks, man. If that happens, I really don't. It's going to be insane.
I feel as though they're going to push things as far as they can, because I think there's this quote that we always go back to where someone was asking Nomura about this exact thing, and he basically said like, if you're not happy with it, the original game's still available.
Yeah, that worries me. That worries me. I don't know. I mean, I'm not, like I say, I think for me that would be like an initial, if it's good, it can obviously be a radically new story and it can still be excellent. And if that happens, I think I would probably, like, initially while playing be pissed off and reject it and be annoyed by it, but then maybe like by the end of the experience it'll win me over and I'll have to concede the fact that, well, yeah, if I do want the original story, I've got Final Fantasy VII, but I did like this story, and I'll just have to treat it as like not maybe Final Fantasy VII remake, but it's just like another Final Fantasy game that I played.
I mean, there were parts throughout the remake where I was thinking, kind of hoping they would push things further, especially like in the sequence where they went underground and were fighting against like the experiments.
Yeah.
Like I was really hoping that they were going to do some kind of introduction to like Deep Ground, because obviously that existed around that time, and to like help build out that lore that we really got to see in Dirge of Cerberus. But like they just didn't really do anything with it that much. It was kind of like, oh, here's this experimental part. You got to do these. It was basically like the learning segment. You got to learn how to use Barrett, and like there were parts like that where I just thought they could really go a bit deeper and start to really build out the lore for like us lore nuts.
Yeah.
But like they just kind of kept it quite vanilla in some instances and didn't really push it that much further.
What do you think is going to happen in terms of how they're going to lay out the world and that kind of stuff in the next game? Do you foresee like basically more of the same in terms of what they've done with the first, with like a more linear sort of pathway, or they're going to try and expand it out?
I think it's going to be kind of similar. I don't think they're going to do like a full world map like they had in the first game. It doesn't seem feasible.
I don't think so.
Because it would just be like a whole world of nothing. Like the world map, like they'd have to make so many new places, and they did that a bit in Crisis Core. But like on like the first place that you're at, you got Calm, you got the Chocobo Ranch, and you've got like the cave, and then you've got Junon, like, and Fort Condor. That's it. Like, there's not
Yeah.
really too many places they can go. So, like, I feel as though it would make sense for them to kind of have that kind of notion of corridors, like they had between like Wall Market and like
Hmm.
where Eris lived, and like
Yeah.
the church, but like maybe have some loading screens in there so you can skip between them a little bit more, fast travel.
Yeah. Maybe 12-esque
Yeah, yeah.
potentially.
So Calm is going to want to be a place where you can explore and experiment around, but there's not anything really nearby Calm.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
you just be walking for ages if they're going to keep
Yeah.
it to scale, unless they're going to add a load of new stuff in.
Yeah. Potentially. I mean, I'm wondering how like the whole Wu Tai stuff is going to fit in Wu Tai Yuffie. Like, because isn't it the case that like normally once they exit Midgar, that's when they encounter Yuffie, right? Normally.
Yeah, it's just before Junon is the first
Yeah.
time you can get
So
her.
like I wonder how Yuffie's going to kind of play into the story here in Wu Tai, and like because it gets referenced a fair bit in the first game of the
Yeah, they've been
remake,
building
but
up the Wu Tai War, which wasn't really mentioned in the original game at all.
yeah, it's like that was interesting. I don't know how they're going to work that in the next part.
It does. It does.
Do we know if it's 3 parts, by the way? Did they ever use the number
They
3, or is it just
No, they haven't. They haven't said how many parts. I mean, like, there's the financial analysts who think it's going to be 2. It could be 4. Three seems the most logical, but then it's going back to like, if it's 3, where's the next part going to end? Because there's so many potential cut points. Like, really, they could end at after Junon, based on how they managed to build out Midgar. Like,
yeah,
the whole calm is like a huge part of the game, because you've got the flashback sequence where like Sephiroth and young Cloud, um and like they could really expand like Fort Condor and make that an actual location they could do things with. I don't know what they're going to do with Chocobos at the time. And then like Junon itself could be huge.
someone also mentioned the other day on the stream, like I was chatting that even like Gold Saucer's freaking huge. Like if you
Yeah,
want to truly remake Golden Saucer, that's like a game in itself.
because
It's
like
insane.
the disc one in the first game ended at Temple of the Ancients, and like, that's like, based on how much they managed to elongate Midgar. Temple of the Ancients is miles away. Like, that's
Exactly.
because you've got like so many, like you got yeah, like Calm, you've got Junon, you've got Gold Saucer, Coral, you've got to go Cosmo Canyon, Gongaga,
Yeah.
Nibelheim, Rocket Town. Like, there are so many locations and things that have to happen before you even get to that point.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, like we've been saying, are they going to put even more stuff in that wasn't in the original? So if you've got all of that already, and you want to potentially put in some things that were left on the cutting floor from the first game, or you want to, I don't know, fuse together a bit more of what happens in like the other games, that kind of thing. It's just it all seems so enormous in scale that I don't know how they're going to do it. Really, I'm
No,
curious.
I have no idea. I mean, it seems as though they're going to go for like longer between releases. So especially with like 16 kind of
Mm.
rearing its head, I
Yeah,
doubt they're going to release in the same year. Um,
yeah, same.
so like, it could mean that the next part is longer than this part. Like, it is actually like a much longer experience. It could be like a 40, 50, 60-hour game if you're
Mm.
not playing on hard.
Yeah,
Um, and they could do it so that like they really elongate it out and kind of end on a proper crescendo. But I think my biggest question mark in my head is, how are they going to top the end boss that they had in the first part? Like, he was the end boss
mm.
of the entire first game, and they've already done that. They've burst that
True.
load. How can you top the original end boss as the next end boss? Like, is it going to be like Super Sephiroth, or like?
I feel like they can always come up with a new Sephiroth. Like if there's one thing they can find a new way to take him to some other heights, it's like they'll probably find a way to make some kind of super Sephiroth. But like you say, I mean, it's they did. I think I was surprised that we actually got to battle Sephiroth. I mean, the whole kind of Arbiter of Fate stuff at the end of the first remake, that was like, okay, yes, this is this sort of big godly figure that we're slaying, and I was like, okay, very Final Fantasy, I get it. But then when we actually had to fight, I thought Sephiroth might kind of tease us at the end of the game,
Hmm.
and we wouldn't really do battle with him in that way. But we did get to have like a, even like the one-winged angel part of it and that kind of thing. I was like, okay, right, we had a proper Sephiroth battle as well, like to top it all off. So like you say, I don't know, man. I'm really, really curious, and I just hope it doesn't get so sort of big and complicated in scale that it kind of implodes on them and end up kind of
Yeah.
having to release something that they're not happy with.
Do you feel as though it was necessary for them to build it up that big in the end? Because the comparison I always think about is the Lord of the Rings. Like that was a pre-existing trilogy that everyone knew about. They knew roughly what the cut points were going to be, and like they still kept it reasonably traditional to the books. Like they took some liberties here and there, but like the end of the first film kind of ended like with them just walking across a plane. Like there wasn't some like they had the Balrog, right? They just kind of got past that bit, I think. But like it was just kind of like it ended and everyone was like, oh, can't wait to see what's going to happen in the next part, because they kind of knew what was going to happen in the next part, and I'd never read the book, so I was still equally excited about what was going to happen, but they didn't make people wait 3 or 4 years for the next bit.
Yeah, I think like you say, I mean, if it was a much more mellow ending, kind of a smaller scale battle, and then it turned into more of just like you say, just kind of we're exiting Midgar now and like having some dialogue and kind of ending it on that sort of note, I don't think too many people would have been particularly like upset by it, because I mean the Shimra Tower bit was pretty intense, and obviously you had the motorcycle chase. It could have still had a big boss battle at the end of it and ended it in that way. But like all I can think of is just that they probably deemed it necessary to still make it like this self-contained Final Fantasy game, that even though it's a part one of something bigger, when you look at it in isolation, like forget what happens in the rest of the game. You could treat Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 as its own sort of start to end sort of experience. It does end obviously on a cliffhanger, but I think maybe by having it like that, it felt more like a typical Final Fantasy experience, because they knew they weren't going to put another one out for many years, just to tide people over and give them that Final Fantasy feeling. I don't know.
Yeah, I reckon. I mean, because they didn't originally plan to have Sephiroth as the end boss, right? It was kind of a suggestion put forward by Hamaguchi, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Did the pitch to Nomura, and they were like, okay, sure.
I mean, in terms of like obviously the gameplay and getting to fight him with like the more modern, like the hybrid gameplay system, I did enjoy. By the way, I thought that was it's the best iteration that they have of it so far, I think, for the modern age.
I would agree with that.
And so yeah, I mean that to me like that worked out fine, but it was just like the sort of they so deliberately just set it up on such a giant cliffhanger, and like the whole the unknown journey or whatever. It was just like, damn.
Yeah, and they keep being like, oh, look at the crisp packet.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean at the time that kind of like it flew over my head a bit, like at that time, but afterwards I was like, oh yeah, okay. And then I think another thing that I'm trying to remember now what it was, I wasn't too sure about. We got the visions. They were seeing like these visions, and we had like the final shot of what was it?
It was scenes from Advent Children, wasn't it? They were playing in.
Wasn't it like Nanaki? Like they see a vision of like Nanaki's like offspring, like the final shot of Final Fantasy VII, the main game, where they look over the ruins of Midgar or whatever, right? That's how Final Fantasy VII ended,
Yeah,
wasn't it? Like the final
is
shot.
this showing that the timeline is changing?
Yeah, and then but what I didn't get was, I think at the time it was like they didn't see the end of it. They just literally saw them running. Like we don't, from what I saw, their vision wasn't. You don't see what's at the end of it, if that makes sense. So it's like, how could they deduce what that even was? But just by what they saw, if that
I
makes
think
sense.
it was just something for like fans of the original to be like, like I recognize that, and like to again ask questions, and like it was something you said earlier about the speculation, the theories, and everything, and Katase's quotes. It kind of worried me a little bit, because he basically said like they did all this stuff in the end sequence to get people speculating, because they were curious to see what theories people would come up with. And like when he was talking about like the school is dead theory and stuff, and him basically saying like, oh, I actually don't mind that, and I might incorporate some of that into the remake if we ever do it. I'm thinking like, so like if people have come up with decent theories that they hadn't thought of, I feel as though there's going to be some kind of confirmation there, like that they're going to incorporate some of these theories that people have come up with into the game if they think they're valid. And then the people that came up with these theories are going to be like, they're going to feel validated because they predicted it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I guess it's like self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like they kind of spoke it into existence, I guess, in a way.
Exactly. Like, and I kind of feel as though they've basically been really tight-lipped, because I feel part of it is that they'll obviously have an idea about where the story is going, but I don't think it's like fully nailed down or anything.
I think
like
so too.
If there's some concrete things that people come out with that like they think, gosh, that's a really good idea, then sure, like why not go forward with it? Like Nomura is famous for it in terms of like his like always putting out teaser trailers at the end of games, like, especially in Kingdom Hearts, just to kind of see what the vibe is about certain things. And like, you know, part of it could be they put Zack in the ending just to see how people would react to it. And if people are like super positive, like, yeah, Zack's going to be amazing, then chances are we're probably going to see Zack.
Yeah, I mean, it's you got to remember sometimes that these guys are a giant freaking business, and they make these games to make money, and there's obviously got to be a big like marketing PR sort of angle about this whole thing too. We're obviously looking at it as like gamers and like the story and the lore and all this kind of stuff, but sometimes it's just as simple as like we need to make moves that's gonna generate hype and interest and PR and sales and stuff for
Exactly.
this game.
And Zack is gold in that regard, because in Japan he's one of the most popular characters in the whole entire Final Fantasy franchise, let alone 7. Like if they didn't give him more screen time in the game, it would be a massively missed opportunity for them.
Yeah, agreed. I think, I mean, when it came to Zack and like the whole, oh, is Zack possibly alive in this alternate version of event stuff? For me, it was more like it feels like maybe we will get a much more kind of expanded. Maybe we'll have like flashback sections where we get to play as Zack and that kind of thing. Like he will feature a lot more, I'm sure, but it's not in the sense that the narrative has greatly shifted for him to feature in a radically different way, I think.
That's why I'm so curious, because like who knows, right? Who knows? Maybe it has. Maybe because there's like some theories saying that like he's been like during that whole Midgar segment, he's like been behind the scenes, like helping Cloud progress, because they're always talking about like how they're able to progress like more than they should do, and like there's like the people behind helping them behind the scenes. Like he could have been a secret member of Avalanche. Like,
oh man,
there's so many different possibilities in terms of what it means for Zack, because obviously that flash that what they're seeing has happened before what we've just played.
Mm-hmm. I think part of my mind is just like I just hope it doesn't go that way. So I'm just trying not to like dwell on it too much. I'm just gonna wait and see and see what they spring on us for that. I don't want to know.
It's gonna be a journey, that's for sure.
So do you think it's gonna come out before Final Fantasy 16 or after?
I think it's gonna come out after.
Same.
Because like from a marketing perspective, I think that makes sense, because like 7 Remake is already a property that exists now, so they probably don't. They're obviously going to do a lot of marketing before it in the build up, because they're going to introduce the new characters and get people excited about it. But it's a known property, so people know it's coming, and they'll know roughly what to expect. Like the gameplay is going to be changed, but it's not going to be changed radically. Like there's going to be some new characters introduced, but it's not going to be like wholesale changes or anything. Mm-hmm. Whereas 16 needs a bit more of the spotlight. So I would imagine that like 7 Remake is going to go dark for a while, and this is going to be the year of 16.
That's what I would say as well. I mean, the trailer definitely took me by surprise. Like when it arrived and it had like 4 minutes of, it wasn't like pre-rendered footage and stuff either. I was like, oh, okay, damn, there's some progress been made here. So let's like end this conversation by talking about Final Fantasy 16. So what's your take on 16 so far?
I'm curious to see more. Like, I think they took a big risk with the trailer they showed off, especially with the climate we're at now with games. And you know, you look at all of the big companies that exist out there; they're all doing big pre-rendered trailers to get that initial hype boost. Mm-hmm. And Square chose not to do that with 16, and like their reasons for not doing that are valid, but ultimately, it's hard to know how much damage that has done. Mm-hmm. Because like you look at something like Valhalla, it got like dragged through the mud for not the initial trailer, but the second trailer they did during the Xbox showcase, where it was supposed to be the gameplay reveal, and they had like 10 seconds of gameplay. Yeah. But that game sold like crazy, and like there is an expectation out there now that initial pre-rendered trailer, it's not like to set false expectations, it's actually to set expectations about what they can achieve. Like if you go back and watch the reveal trailer for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it set the tone exactly for the experience they were trying to create. And like they didn't go crazy. Like even the original Assassin's Creed, that trailer got so many people excited about the concept, about what the game was going to be. They didn't need to show off gameplay or anything like that, because they they got people sucked into this whole vision of like, oh, you're playing an assassin. It's in like this time period. There's going to be like these concepts introduced. Then they need to deliver some of those concepts when they actually show off the gameplay. But people will be really curious to see how they do that because of what they've seen initially. What I saw outside of the fan base was that there's a lot of trepidation about the game. I think within the fan base, like within our own communities, it's a Final Fantasy game. People are naturally going to be excited about what's going to come, and they're going to give it a fair shake.
Mm-hmm.
But outside of that, if you don't have that loyalty to the brand, you saw a game that probably did not look visually appealing compared to the other PlayStation 5 games being shown. And there are a lot of things going on that probably didn't make too much sense because like it was just like random story clips that like have no context to anything. And like we made a comment as our channel on like the PlayStation 5 showcase live stream saying how
Okay.
great we thought the game looked, and we just got like people were just commenting basically saying like, you guys like smoking crack or something, like this game did not look good, like what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be interesting to see how they work to recover from that, because that, like, I mean, you've probably experienced it as well, like for franchises and games where you don't have like this innate bias towards, like Final Fantasy, I'm there, I'm done, like I'm probably going to buy it no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
But like other games, like I'm not convinced. Like you have to sell me, and typically how I am is that if the initial drop draws me in, I'm done. I'm gonna make that commitment. I probably won't actually look at any other news from until release. Like Death Stranding, I
Yeah.
knew based on the fact it was Kojima and what I initially saw in that kind of like first trailer or two. I didn't really watch anything else. I didn't need to watch anything else. I like they sold me on what they do, what it was, and like yeah, sure. And when I haven't played it yet. I bought it, but I still haven't played it. But
Okay.
when I play it, it may not appeal to me, but they did the initial job of getting me interested in it. They didn't need to do anything else. And like with 16, I'm worried that they've lost out on that. Whereas like Project Athia, people were talking about like crazy how great it looked. It was like
Yeah.
this like really short trailer, and like PlayStation even had it as their like header for their YouTube channel and everything. Like there were so many other games that were shown off that like were appealing because of what they showed, but 16 I feel like it struggled a bit.
Yeah, I think I agree pretty much with everything you said there. I mean, when I was going through what I was thinking about it as well, I just the thing that hit me the most was that it didn't feel like it had the sort of the Final Fantasy trailer wow factor that I was used to seeing from previous trailers. I mean, at the end of the day, a trailer is a marketing tool. It's there just to get people interested and to get people hyped and to sell them an idea. And so to present it in that way, like you say, I do question their decision to do it like that. I mean, it could have even been some kind of mix of like still having some stuff that was maybe. I mean, I talked about even like the terrain and like the color palette and that kind of thing. It just, to me, Final Fantasy has always got to have a bit of this sort of, you know, this color, this vibrance, this sort of visual, this visual spectacle kind of going on. And sure, like the summons look cool and that kind of thing, but I don't know, like maybe the world or something, or just like the visuals, it really didn't, in that sense, it definitely didn't sell me as like, oh man, I'm so hyped. But you know, it's early enough that I'm not going to make any like big conclusions about it. Of course, I'm excited just because of the fact that it exists and you know it's coming, but I will need to be seeing more. I mean, from my perspective, the thing that I guess the second hand excitement that I have for it stems from the fact that there are a lot of people that's involved in the success of Final Fantasy XIV. Well, let's say the redemption story of Final Fantasy XIV, and a lot of those people are behind or a part of 16 as well. And the people I know who have been playing Final Fantasy XIV and have been through that sort of, you know, from it being poor at release to the great experience it is now, they all tell me that in that sense it's in safe hands because these guys have done a fantastic job. So I'm kind of banking on the fact that these guys are right, and that if these people are sort of involved in it, it is going to be, you know, even if it's not visually appealing to me right now, I think once it does all come together, I think it's going to be a good experience.
Yeah, and I think what they've released so far, like the small lore drop they did with the launch of the official website, like there's so many odes to kind of tactics and like Yoshida is a really big fan of Matsuno and the Evil East world. I'm just hopeful that what they've kind of teased so far delivers, because like they've talked about like basically all of these different different factions there's going to
Yeah.
be. There's going to be like potential conflicts between the factions and everything, and I just really hope it doesn't go down the route of 12 and it goes more down the route of tactics.
Okay, I've not played Tactics for the record, but I agree with you on like hopefully it doesn't go down 12. I mean, I saw the crystal thing, like I'd made a video on like the lore drop that they put on the website too, and when I saw like the artwork that they included for that stuff, it did kind of boost my morale a bit. I did like the aesthetic and the look of like these giant like powerful crystals and that kind of thing. But I was like, part of me was like, I kind of hope they didn't go down the crystal route again. I mean, crystals just feature so frequently that I think for me a lot of my favorite Final Fantasies don't really feature crystals. Like 15 was like about like the crystal, and 12 had crystals and shards and all this kind of stuff. Like if you ask me, they could have used a different vessel other than crystals maybe for that, but it's just a personal thing in terms of like crystals being
Yeah,
used
I
in
guess
Final Fantasy games.
they're trying to bring it back to its roots. It's a game about crystals and summons.
Yeah, I get it, but I don't know. Like a lot of the greatest Final Fantasies didn't need it, and like it didn't seem like a necessary thing for it. But again, I mean, it's such early days.
It is interesting because like you could argue that in many ways Final Fantasy has lost its identity, and like they've done a really bad job of building momentum with the franchise. Like every single game since 10 has been different to the previous one. There's not really been too much that's carried over or that's been built upon. It's like, if they didn't have the name Final Fantasy splashed on them, you could look at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and now 16 and 7 Remake and think that they're from completely different franchises in some instances. Um, and like I'm hoping that with 16 that it does have a really close connection with 14 on that basis, and like there can be, even if the like 16 isn't related to 15 or the 7 remake or 13 or whatever, as long as it has a close relationship with 14, that will be a good step in the right direction for me, because it can, like, people that play 14 will be interested in 16, as you said, based on the fact that 14 has done such a good job. Like, and there's a lot of people that play 14 that haven't played other games in the franchise, and maybe this could be their step into the other numbered games. And people that play 16 that have never played 14 could be tempted to go and play that because they had such a good experience with that game. Like, it feels as though if they can get that relationship right, it will be a really good tool for them to kind of work those two experiences up. But like, who knows what, like, if they're going to have any kind of 16 is going to have any kind of relationship with 7 remake. Like, it's just kind of this weird position where we're at with the franchise, because we could have two games coming out pretty close with 14 still building out. But like, what is Final Fantasy anymore? It's a deep philosophical question. Like,
Yeah, that's gonna have to be for another podcast, I think, for that particular question. But I think in more recent years that they have definitely been on like the recovery path. I think with the redemption of 14, I've not played it personally, but obviously secondhand, I've been reading about it, I've been talking to people about it, and 14's improved so much, and 7 remake was well received by most of the community, and people are excited about 16. It feels like they're definitely getting back on track, and there is potential if like remake part 2 doesn't disappoint, and 16 does a late stage 14 and ends up like really capturing the imagination. It could really put them back on the map as a franchise, I think.
yeah, it's a very exciting time, I'd say, especially for us, obviously, as creators.
Sure.
It's there's so much in the horizon to look forward to, and we haven't really had that for a long period of time. Like,
Yeah.
like kind of the dark years we had, like after 13 came out, really, because like, yeah, 13T was decent. Lightning Returns was not everyone's cup of tea. But
What
like,
did you, just as a side thing, what did you think about 13.3, by the way?
Lightning Returns,
Yeah.
uh, I thought it was okay. I I struggled with the time concept. I didn't think it was that great or delivered that well. And I thought, like, it didn't really have the same feel as the previous games because it was lightning by like being solo. Like it didn't. They basically tried to reintroduce the franchise within a mini series, and like to the point where like they didn't use the traditional logo because they wanted people to realize it's a brand new experience. But it's like it's not. It's a sequel.
Yeah, it's a sequel of a sequel.
Yeah, like it should be similar, and there were similarities, but like they changed so much of that game
hmm
compared to the previous two. So it was okay. It was, for me, it was definitely the weakest of the three.
Interesting. I think for me, like the Final Fantasy 13-3 is one of the more interesting experiences I've had playing. Um, Initially, like if you'd asked me to rank the 13 games, I would have just gone 13, 13-2, 13-3. But after playing 13-3 a second time, it leapfrogged the second game. I like it more than the second game now. And I think for me, most of it stemmed from actually the world and the side quests. Interesting enough, the first time I played it was for the movie version when the game was new. And again, to get the content out, I was much more focused on just completing the main story and editing together the footage and all that kind of thing. So I never really got into like the world and the side quests and that kind of thing. But the second time around, I actually made much more effort to do the side quests. And initially, when I started the playthrough, I said to people, I was like, it's probably likely I do maybe like half the side quests, 70% of them. I've never been like a completionist for the sake of completion kind of guy. Like I have to really enjoy the game to bother kind of doing everything. But then as the playthrough went on, I just got really like invested and like interested in the world. And I think so much of like what is lost in the main narrative is actually found in the side quests. It really pleased me in that sense. So simple things like the fact that, let's say, I don't know, 500 years has gone by and people aren't aging anymore. Now that's a super interesting part of the narrative, and to me, like in the main story, they literally don't really talk about it at all. It's like they just say, okay, I've been in a crystal stasis for 500 years and I'm back or whatever. But that's really important. Like, how does a world look and function and feel? What are people's approaches to life like? And what about a kid that's been stuck in a kid's body for 500 years and now they're all that kind of stuff? You don't really explore any of that while you're playing the story, but you do the side quests and you get these really interesting stories that come out of it, and like you get these interconnected side quests and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, like battle wise, there was some good battle stuff too. Like it really impressed me. Like side quest wise, I think it blew a lot of other Final Fantasies out of the water, if you ask me.
It's interesting actually because yeah, like when I played it, I've only played it once, and I do remember like I was getting a bit frustrated with the time mechanic because especially when I like first was getting used to it because I felt like I didn't have enough time, like I was being rushed to play through things, and obviously like once you get more experience, that rush isn't going to be there. But like I remember like I think one of the first things you're looking for like posters around this Luxarian. What's the name of the
Yeah,
yeah
Luxurian.
and like I couldn't find the last poster, and I was getting really freaked out because the time was running out. And then I found out like you can't even get it on that day; like it spawns the next day. Like they like it really rubbed me the wrong way, and it like I think it set me up to like be really paranoid about not having enough time to do things. So I like tried to do as much as I could,
hmm
but I didn't really. Yeah, I probably didn't manage to do that much just because I didn't really feel like I could or should.
I think in that sense, what helped me the most was because I'd already played through the game once. It was one of those experiences where I didn't mind consulting a guide. So before starting the second playthrough, because like you say, there are these time constraints and that kind of thing, I did make a list of like the quests in every single area, what day are they available, between what times, and it allowed me to sort of plan out what I was going to do much better. But for people experiencing the game for the first time, that's obviously not how you should really be playing it. And criticism related to that, I think, is 100% fair. But it's just one of those games that when I did experience it in that way, and I really got to really engage with the world and do all the side quests, and you get to see a lighter side of Lightning as well, the way she interacts with people, the way she helps people. I felt like once you got that experience, like that was the best that Final Fantasy 13-3 had to offer. And it's a shame that it wasn't really executed and presented in like as good a way as it should have been. But
I mean, it sounds like you're describing the 13 franchise in general because like especially the first game, the base story is decent, but like so much of the game's lore and everything around it is housed within the data log and like all the different materials you have to try and research. And I remember we did like a post-mortem like a year after the release. We had done a lot of research into the story, and like it's like they built out this amazing narrative of like this huge lore of all the gods and the interactions between them all and all the fallacy, the Lassie, and like if you actually like take into context the whole lore that they crafted for 13, it's amazing.
Yeah,
But like you didn't really get to see any of it in the actual game itself.
it's true. That's why 13 is in that sense is a difficult game to judge, because I don't like just saying like, oh well, it was there if you just look for it, like trying to blame the player for not researching it enough and being able to enjoy it and appreciate it enough in that sense. I don't think that's a right way to look at it either. But the fact that it is there, it is a positive, because it is there if you do want to
Yeah,
search for it and invest the time. So it's like a double-edged sword, really.
they just did a really bad job of telling the story. Basically, is how I look at it. Like the previous games, like you didn't need to look at all that stuff to have a good experience with the story and to have it really resonate with you. Like 10 would be a classic example, right? There's so much depth to that story, but on your first playthrough, it's such an impactful ride. And then your second playthrough, you get to see everything from a completely different perspective, because you know like how characters were feeling at certain moments and why they behaved in certain ways. And like with 13, it wasn't there. You could play it again and again and again. It's still not there. You have to read something.
Yeah, it's true. I definitely think so. But I mean, at least for Final Fantasy 13 3, if you ever get time, or like you're going to stream it someday, like I'd 100% recommend just like making a list of like the quests, or like having them up so you know which one to go to and when, so you're not under stress. And if you do that, you'll have plenty of time like left over to do whatever you need to do. And I do think that like you will gain a bit more. It won't make you like love it, but I think you'll definitely enjoy the experience a lot more.
I mean, there are like a fair few people that do say they really like Lightning Returns, and I think it's like definitely yeah, like maybe if you do go through that experience you've talked about there, it will change things quite considerably. But I feel like it's definitely a Marmite experience for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I'm not. It's not like I'm not going to say, oh, anyone who didn't like Final Fantasy 13 has no idea what they're talking about, or whatever. But like, there is definitely like a kind of a diamond-ish in the dirt. Like if you're willing to experience it in that sort of way. I mean, it's more so than Final Fantasy 13 2 was. Put it that way. For me, having played them all.
13-2 is kind of ironic though, because it was that game where they attempted to literally adjust or address every piece of criticism that the first game had, to like often to its detriment.
Yeah.
Like they just went so extreme in trying to correct and kind of like cater to all the criticism. Oh, the game was too linear. You don't want linearity? Well, look at this game, guys. We're all over the place.
Yeah, they went mad. They went mad with 13 2. It's true. But I guess it goes to show that they do. I always wonder, like, how much do they really look at like fan feedback, and like how much they really care about what the fans think. But Square Enix sometimes they do strike me as a company that really do. I don't know how much they admit that they do, but like some things, like you say, it does feel like they really do listen and like take things into account for what they do in the future.
Yeah, I think it's obviously they're gonna take the pieces of feedback that they like, but I know that like Final Fantasy 12, they did a lot more focus testing with Western audiences for that game, and they were really trying to make a game that would appeal to Westerners, because they thought that Westerners were their future. And I mean, it's kind of those things where you're thinking though, like a lot of the people in the West liked the games because they weren't Western,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
like so like they wanted to create, they didn't quite understand that we liked their games and they did so well because they were made Japanese. They like had this all these quirks and everything, and like they were so different from Western RPGs. That was the charm, that was the appeal to them. And then they started trying to make their games more Western, which is like 12 was like super open world, and like it was such a different vibe to everything, and it did critically amazingly well in the West. I think it's like the best reviewed Final Fantasy game ever in the West, I think.
Hmm.
um
Interesting.
and like it like they've gradually been kind of eroding trust in but with their Japanese audience by their pursuit of the Western sales.
Yeah, it's just it's an impossible balancing act, I guess, to get it right. But one of the things I always talk about is the well, what I consider to be, I'm sure most would agree, like the golden age of Square, where like between like 1994 and 2001, like in the space of 7 years, they released 5 games, like Final Fantasy 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And it's like, how on earth did they manage to make so many of those games so good in such a short space of time? It just blows my mind. Like, I don't
I
know
think
how they did that.
they just knew what they were doing. I think like it's the mistake that they've made with how things go now, where if you think about who worked on those games, right, it was pretty much the same staff, and they had rotations, like they had kind of two teams set up at some point. But like yeah, like 6, 7, 8 were pretty much the same teams, just back to back. You're off one game, you're on the next one. And obviously, like between 6 and 7, most of that team had to work on Chrono Trigger as well in between. Um, but like 9, they had a slightly different team, which is what has a very different vibe.
But I mean, they always work. That's what I mean. Like,
Yeah,
if you look across 7, 8, and 9, they're all pretty different from each other, but they all just worked. Like, I
but
don't
they had
know.
like core staff members that were retained, right? So,
Yeah,
like you think one of the big things for me is battle systems. Like 6, 7, 8, 9, all had pretty much the same battle system. They just kind of tweaked
yeah,
things here and there because Hiroyuki Ito was pretty much involved with all of them. Like he was the battle person. He wasn't directly involved in 7, but he kind of like was there consulting because he was doing tactics instead. And then like 10, it wasn't it was a radical change. Like it didn't use the ATB system, but it was still a turn-based battle system that was basically like the same kind of concept. It was conditional turn-based. And then like after that, they just were like every single battle system has been completely different.
yeah.
Like
It's true.
there's been no like they it seems like they've just done everything they possibly can to make their lives more difficult for each other. Like
Yeah,
there are so many concepts that were similar in the first like 10 games, like job classes, like the ATB system, different mechanics they want to use, the magic spells. But whereas now they feel as though every single game they have to start from scratch. It has to be like a complete revision about what Final Fantasy is.
yeah. So there's your identity thing that you mentioned previously. I think the gameplay is probably one aspect that has made them lose their identity in that sense, for sure.
Exactly. And like that it kind of worries me about 16 because if I'm thinking about things like logically, you'd think, okay, 7 Remake had a gameplay system that was pretty much universally loved. We should be doing everything we possibly can to put that in 16
Yes.
because it just makes sense. And then like the new battle director, I think Suzuki, they've brought on board, he can do what they used to do in the olden days, where he can take the battle system from 7 Remake, he can tweak it, he can modify it a little bit, but at its core, it's roughly the same. And they'll do the same with the 7 Remake Part 2 as well. They'll make some modifications and they'll tweak things. That would save them so much time because it's done. It's already made. They just like make some adjustments. It's fine. But I feel as though they're not going to do that, and 16 is going to have a completely original battle system that's going to be like nothing we've ever seen before. So then you're going to have two experiences that are both Final Fantasy releasing roughly around the same time that have no relation to each other, really.
Yeah, I hope you're wrong in that sense, because what you said before about them maintaining like this new and more consistent way of having gameplay in Final Fantasy games, I think that's got to be a crucial part to maintaining like the franchise's identity moving forward, rather than just like, spiky haired protagonist or whatever. So I think Final Fantasy VII Remake got so close to nailing it that surely I'm just hoping like they see sense and they're like, we've kind of figured it out. And I think with like 13 and like 15, that it seemed to me like they were trying to figure it out. And I think with 7 Remake, that's hopefully they acknowledge that probably this is the closest that they've gotten, and that from here on that they should use this as like the template and just work around it, so that from like this point forward, this is the generally the gameplay and the battle system that Final Fantasy fans can expect to be engaging with when they play a new Final Fantasy game. I think that would work best, personally.
That's us being super optimistic, though.
Yep, agreed. But I don't know. One can hope, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's if they want to build it out and get back to those golden days, then it feels like that's what they need to do, because like when people were picking up a Final Fantasy experience back then, they knew roughly what they were going to get. Like sure, the jump between 6 and 7 was a big shock to people graphically, and there were people that didn't like it, but they made a change to one aspect of the game, and most people resonated with that change. It elevated what people had expected from that area, but like they kept the gameplay the same. Like there were modifications, sure. Like they evolved the limit break concept from desperation attacks. The materia system was like a modified relic system. Like they like took things that they introduced in 6 and changed them around a little bit. And like 8 was the same. Like they had the junction system, but ultimately it was still the same core battle system. You had like 3 party members. There was like the attack command. You got magic. You can do summons. Like it's and like the mechanically it was pretty much the same. It was just like the under the hood that was different. 9 the same again. Like
Yeah, I think 9 looked even more like 6. I think of 7, 8, and 9, I think 9 was probably the closest to 6.
yeah, and like Ito was the director of both of those, so
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense, right? Like they had that degree of consistency. Like the first 10 games were directed by 3 people, whereas since then we've had a different director and leadership team for every single game who want to put their own mark stamp on it. I think like 12 being a main numbered game was a big mistake for them because it was so different. Like Tactics was not a main number game for a reason. It was a very different experience, very different gameplay, and like their 9 was even considered at one point that they were going to make that a guiding game, like a spin-off, because it was quite different thematically, but they kind of brought it more in line. But like they I think they got so held up on the numbered the importance of the number that they didn't want to create these side experiences, like because they just didn't have anything available. Like
Yeah. I mean, I guess, the numbered Final Fantasies are still the focal point, so that they always need that next numbered Final Fantasy to keep the franchise like chugging along.
exactly. And I guess after 10, like Sakaguchi had gone, Kitase like didn't want to, like either he was promoted or he didn't want to do directing anymore, and so they had to find someone else, and they were like, well, Matsuno's done a decent job with Tactics, and so we'll give him a shot at it. I guess.
Yeah.
And then Toriyama was obviously supposed to be doing 13, but his vision for Final Fantasy was very different from Kitase and Sakaguchi, even though he'd worked on 10 and was like a main part of the story for that.
Like you say, I think that consistency is going to be interesting. Like because the old guard is kind of changing. Like for 7 remake, they're all around. Like the original guys are kind of there, but moving forward, I guess I do wonder if they're ever going to catch that sort of consistency again. Maybe like eventually that they decided that they didn't want to stagnate and just keep making the same kind of game over and over again. But like in hindsight, looking back at what they've created, I think you can quite clearly see what's worked better for them, I think, as a franchise, and hopefully they'll be able to get back to that is all I can really say.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Okay, so I think on that more optimistic note, I think we'll round this one off. It's been really great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your time and your knowledge.
You're welcome. It's been great to have a chat as well.
All right, I will see you soon. Take care, man.
Catch you later.